As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. I'd like to tell you all about my new book, but since this is YouTube, I better not tell you exactly what it's about. So I'll say just this. Remember that thing that happened, and then they shut everything down because they said that would help with the thing? And then they just ignored all the bad things that happened because of their supposed war on the thing? And if you mentioned any of that, you were a grandma killer? Remember they said they were just trying to prevent us from getting the thing, but we all wound up getting the thing anyway? And remember they predicted that the Super Bowl or the college football national championship or a big packed Texas Rangers game would lead to huge outbreaks of the thing? But then, in fact, the opposite of that happened. And then you would ask them, why is the thing no worse in places where they're not doing anything about the thing than in other places? And they had embarrassingly stupid responses to that. Well, my book takes a sledgehammer to the whole thing, and you're absolutely going to love and devour it. I can't tell you what the thing is, but what I can do is direct you to this website right here. Go to this website. Greatest website in the history of the world, believe me. And it's all about my book and the thing.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Up to now, you have been offered in the history of philosophy the spectacle of two basic alternatives: the Heraclitean sophist approach and the Pythagorean Platonist approach. And in each major branch of philosophy, these two have their characteristic positions. In metaphysics, one side says there is no objective reality. Nothing exists, nothing is, everything is becoming. The other side says that's wrong. There are two realities. There is a true reality, which is non-material and superior to this one, and this imperfect semi-real reflection in which we live. In epistemology, one side says knowledge is impossible. It's all a matter of opinion. Man is the measure of all things. He can only say, what seems to me now. That's the skeptic viewpoint. The other side says this is wrong. There is objective knowledge, and it is gained by coming into contact with the superior dimension, not with the facts of this world. And as Plato interpreted that, you recall, it meant you recollect your innate ideas, the ones that you acquired from previous life, and you achieve this ultimately by a mystic insight into an ineffable principle. In ethics, we have whim-worshipping subjectivism, accompanied by might makes right, versus the claim that, again, this is wrong, ethics is objective, but it consists of turning away from life on earth, and if you remember the quote from the Phaedo, practicing the profession of dying, and if you remember the Republic and the laws, also of ruling men by force. So we have no reality, two realities: skepticism, mysticism, whim-worshipping subjectivism, or ascetic supernaturalism. Now, what about the possibility of a philosophy which would advocate one reality, this one, which would say that objective knowledge is possible of this world, gained by logic operating on the evidence of the senses, which would say that there is such a thing as an objective ethics, and that its standard is man's happiness on earth as an end in itself to be achieved by being rational here on earth? Is there such a third alternative? And you know, of course, there is. There is one philosopher who lays down for the first time the fundamental basis for a rational philosophy, one that is neither skeptic nor mystic. That philosopher is Aristotle, our subject for the next 2 weeks. When I began the lecture on Plato, I said that he was a great philosophic genius, and on at least 3 counts: in his originality, in the depth and grandeur of his power of abstraction, and in his capacity for systematic integration. I now wish to say the same things about Aristotle. He was as original as Plato, even more so in a way, inasmuch as there were no significant precursors of Aristotle's approach to philosophy, whereas Plato had the Pythagoreans to set his overall direction, and of course many of the other pre-Socratics contributed to Plato's view. Before Aristotle, there was only Platonic mysticism, sophistic subjectivism, and millennia of barbarism and ignorance. Aristotle had as profound a capacity for philosophic abstraction as Plato, and if you judge by the scope of the works of his which have survived to our day, he had an even greater power for all-encompassing systematic integration. But there is still another factor here. There is one crucial difference between Plato and Aristotle, besides Aristotle's and besides their common originality, profundity, and brilliant capacity for integration, and that is that Aristotle's philosophy in its essentials is true, which makes Aristotle a phenomenon without precedent in the history of thought. Dante, many centuries later, called Aristotle the master of them that know, and this was a simple statement of the exact truth. During the medieval period, after Aristotle's thought was rediscovered, he was characteristically referred to simply as the philosopher. And this was also an exact statement. Because if truth on essential fundamental issues, is a vital part of philosophy, then Aristotle's is the only philosophy. In other words, the only true philosophy, speaking of essential fundamental approach. Aristotelianism in this sense is philosophy. It is philosophy as a rational science versus philosophy as a rationalization for subjective whims or mystic trances. Aristotle is the philosopher. Whatever his errors, and he made many, as we'll see, his system has been the base and the foundation on which every major human achievement ever since has been built, and without which none would have been possible, whether you take the development of modern science, or the Industrial Revolution, or the creation of the United States of America. As Ayn Rand has observed, the history of the West has in a certain way been a duel between Plato and Aristotle across all the centuries. Whenever and to whatever extent Platonism was dominant, the results on earth were mysticism, regression, brutality, suffering. Whenever and to the extent that Aristotelianism was dominant, the results were reason, progress, freedom, human happiness.
So on Friday night, the UN Security Council met and voted on a resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza, a real ceasefire, and 13 out of the 15 members voted in favor of it. One member, the UK, abstained from voting, and only one member voted against the ceasefire in Gaza, and that was the US. And because the US is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it has veto power, so that means it killed the resolution. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Saturday said that he appreciated the U.S. vetoing a UN Security Council resolution that called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and vowed to continue his war in the besieged enclave, which has killed at least 18,000 Palestinians. And that's the latest update from Gaza's health ministry that they put out Sunday. So Netanyahu said, quote, "Other countries must also understand that it's impossible to support the elimination of Hamas on one side and on the other to call for the end of the war, which will prevent the elimination of Hamas. Therefore, Israel will continue our just war to eliminate Hamas and achieve the war's other objectives that we set," end quote. So the U.S. is facing global backlash and criticism from fellow UN Security Council members for being the only one to vote against a ceasefire resolution, as Israel is killing civilians at a historic pace. This Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gambled that a strong Hamas, but not too strong, would keep the peace and reduce pressure for a Palestinian state. So this is the report here I'm just going to read from. Just weeks before Hamas launched the deadly October 7th attacks on Israel, the head of Mossad arrived in Doha, Qatar for a meeting with Qatari officials. For years, the Qatari government had been sending millions of dollars a month into the Gaza Strip, money that helped prop up the Hamas government there. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel not only tolerated these payments, he had encouraged them. During his meetings in September with the Qatari officials, according to several people familiar with the secret discussions, the Mossad chief David Barnea was asked a question that had not been on the agenda. Did Israel want the payments to continue? So again, this is Qatar asking Israel if they want these payments to Hamas to continue. And Mr. Netanyahu's government had recently decided to continue the policy, so Mr. Barnea said yes, the Israeli government still welcomed the money from Doha. Allowing the payments, billions of dollars over roughly a decade, was a gamble by Mr. Netanyahu that a steady flow of money would maintain peace in Gaza, the eventual launching point of the October 7th attacks, and keep Hamas focused on governing, not fighting. The Qatari payments, while ostensibly a secret, have been widely known and discussed in the Israeli news media for many years. And this says basically, it's under much more scrutiny now, and Netanyahu's political opponents are really going after him for this. So the Biden administration is bypassing Congress to get 13,000 rounds of tank ammunition to Israel to fuel its onslaught in Gaza by waiving a congressional review period for foreign weapons sales. So on Friday night, the State Department notified Congress that it was going through with the $106 million sale of 120 millimeter tank ammunition. The U.S. provides Israel with $3.3 billion in foreign military financing each year. So that's money they give Israel that Israel can use to buy U.S. weapons. It's unclear if those funds are being used for this particular sale. A State Department official told the New York Times that the administration invoked an emergency provision in the Arms Export Control Act to push through the sale without congressional oversight. Secretary of State Antony Blinken personally approved the sale and defended the move on Sunday. Blinken said, quote, "Israel is in combat right now with Hamas, and we want to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself against Hamas," end quote. It's Israel killing over 7,000 children is defending itself, apparently. Satsi Hanegbi, and that's Netanyahu's national security advisor, he said on Saturday that Israel was ready to act against the Houthis in Yemen if the U.S. and its allies do not. He said, quote, Israel is giving the world some time to organize in order to prevent this, but if there isn't going to be a global arrangement because it is a global issue, we will act in order to remove this naval siege, end quote. So the Houthis have been targeting Israeli-linked commercial vessels and firing missiles and drones at Israel in response to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. Hanegbi's comments came after reports that said the Biden administration told Israel to leave it to the U.S. to take care of the Houthis. U.S. officials have told Politico that the Biden administration is not planning to strike the Houthis, at least for now. The U.S. has backed a Saudi-led coalition in a war against the Houthis since 2015, although a ceasefire has held relatively well since April 2022. Any U.S. attacks on the Houthis could threaten that truce, and that's something apparently the Saudis have conveyed to the U.S. They don't want the U.S. bombing Yemen. For the time being, the U.S. is looking to form an international naval task force to get its allies to help protect commercial shipping in the Red Sea. The Houthis have shown no sign of backing down. They're warning that they will target any ships that are bound for Israel. And on Sunday, the French military said that a French frigate shot down 2 drones in the Red Sea that were fired from Yemen. So the French are getting in on the action now. And the situation in Yemen, in the Red Sea, is just one area where Israel's assault on Gaza is spilling out into the region. Israel and Hezbollah have traded fire across the Israeli-Lebanon border. And Israeli officials are now threatening war in Lebanon if Hezbollah does not move back from its border. The Israeli defense minister did it last week, and now Hanegbi is making similar comments, basically saying Hezbollah, they don't want them on the border. They want to push them back. And if they can't find a diplomatic agreement, then the military is going to have to act. And Netanyahu has threatened major destruction in Beirut if the situation with Hezbollah escalates into a full-blown war. So he said this a few days ago, quote, if Hezbollah decides to open an all-out war, then with its own hands, it will turn Beirut and southern Lebanon, which are not far from here, into Gaza and Khan Yunis, end quote, saying they'll reduce Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, to rubble.
Well, I mean, I think, again, it's very frustrating, Scott. We talked a lot about this a little bit off camera, which is that, you spend 2 years saying a certain thing's going to happen. You're called an idiot and a Putin lover for those 2 years. And then the mainstream media, realizing that it's happening that way, starts putting out articles saying, the counteroffensive didn't go very well. Oh, Ukraine on the brink, this, that, and the other. So it is very frustrating to have to endure this all the time. The default should just be like every neocon claim is garbage from the get-go, but they get away with it over and over again. But yeah, you're seeing mainstream. Washington Post had a devastating article earlier this week. Even the Economist chief cheerleader for this war. They're realizing they have to get out in front of this failure. Otherwise, it might look like they've been wrong all along. But politically, it's a big deal. There was a fiasco in the Senate this week where Zelensky was supposed to address a closed-door classified session of senators. Republicans got there, and the whole thing looked like a complete joke. So they left, and Zelensky was tipped off to the fact that it was basically an empty room. He flipped out, got super PO'd, and canceled it himself. So huge fiasco for Ukraine in sort of a last-ditch effort to sweet-talk the Americans out of some more money.
What would happen if America stopped supporting Ukraine? And he goes, well, let's look at the history here. And he brings up again this all-important story that's now quintuply confirmed, or maybe even more, about how they were really making progress in the talks at the beginning of the war, where the Russians were going to withdraw back out of the country. I'm sure they're going to still recognize the supposed independence of Donetsk and Luhansk or some kind of deal, but they were essentially going to end the war and withdraw their troops from certainly what's happened since then. And Zelensky was prepared to sign it until the Americans and the Brits forced him to quit. Yeah, typical. It's typical. I mean, it's come out, and that was admitted by the top advisor to Zelensky, David Arakhamia. Mm-hmm. Admitted that, I think in The Economist it was last week, that this is what's happened. Boris Johnson, I don't know if you saw this, Scott, but he called for his government to come up with a plan for a military raid on the Netherlands to get some vaccines from them. This guy is unhinged. He's as nutty as a fruit. I mean, our rulers are so insane and so stupid. I mean, if just looking at who is ruling over us doesn't make you libertarian, I don't know what will. Yeah, but yeah, he's a guy that literally rolled in and said, "No, you guys can't do this. Don't worry, we'll give you everything you want. Don't worry, you guys. Fight on, boys. Fight on, boys." Mm-hmm. And then he went off to guzzle a few gallons of whiskey or something. It's just incredible. It is. See, it seems sort of unreal. But then you go, well, look at Boris Johnson. Look at Kamala Harris. I saw the headline. I didn't believe. I mean, who knows what they really mean by these things, but that they even try this. It's like a TV show. They go, well, Kamala Harris is now in charge of Gaza policy. Oh, come on. Like, some of us have work to do here. Stop wasting my time with this craziness, you know? And this kind of thing. Like you say, Boris freaking Johnson somehow became the prime minister of Britain. Already, I'm accusing you of pulling my leg. And now he come in and completely blew up a peace negotiation. And as you say, this guy, David Arkamia, he was the leader of the Ukrainian delegation, now confirming this part of the story. And so, and look, and as Connor O'Keefe says in this piece, Dan, he says, you could see what they were thinking, that Ukraine's initial resistance to Russia was so successful compared to what they thought was going to happen, that they said, all right, let's go for broke. Instead of, whew, that's a relief that the entire military and state didn't get smashed to smithereens. And so at least we'll be able to salvage something. Let's compromise now and accept our 2/3 of a loaf. And instead, I don't know what Zelensky was thinking, but the Americans and the Brits were thinking, no, now's the time to press our advantage, which they never had.
Let's roll into Moscow. But that whole thing, Scott, is only because they believe their own bullcrap, because they incorrectly concluded that for Russia, it was about taking territory. Even though Putin was very explicit, it's about demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. And so when they initially went into Kiev and took a couple airfields, but didn't continue on and capture the city, the geniuses in D.C., in the Beltway, and their allies across Europe concluded incorrectly that this was plucky little Ukraine standing up for itself, when in fact, people that we know who actually are experts, like McGregor and Ritter and the others, Johnson, they knew all along. I mean, it was very obvious. They did not want to have to occupy Kiev at this point. Their goals, which they were explicit about, were demilitarization, denazification, and they continue grinding onward. But the U.S. can't, these people can't let go of this idea that wars are only about territorial conquest. You know, that's the only thing they can think. So that's what this whole thing was built on, a lie anyway.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that, switch gears back to U.S. politics again. Vivek Ramaswamy took it to Nikki Haley in, I guess, what's the final Republican debate of the season last night by challenging her to name any of the provinces in eastern Ukraine that she wants America to fight for. And man, that was great. She just sat there.
Moment. I mean, he is a mixed bag, but when he's on, he's on fire.
And that's a real risk, because she could have said, what, are you kidding me? Of course it's Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporozhye and Kherson and whatever. Like, that ain't that hard, bro. We got to save Kharkiv before it falls back under Russian domination. Like, that's, any idiot could tell you that if you want to take that point of view. So he was making a gamble, but he gambled right. She didn't have the first clue. She never heard of Donetsk and Luhansk. She don't know nothing about it, Dan, nothing.
Do you sense a general realization among Western elites, except for Joe Biden and Blinken and the White House and the State Department, that Ukraine has been, that the war in Ukraine is over and Ukraine can go nowhere?
Except for the people in London, yes, there's a wide recognition that that far from what Biden said 2 months ago, that Russia has already lost, it's just the other way around. It got mixed up, okay? Russia had already won. Now, the question is what he's going to tell Zelensky on Wednesday. My God, you know, why would he want Zelensky coming in to talk to him tete-a-tete? I fear the worst. These guys are in real trouble. What kind of deus ex machina, what kind of special surprise, special false flag operation are they planning? I mean, that's the only thing that makes sense for them to meet. So, yeah, I'm really worried, because as all these other leaders watch on, they also see that Biden and his coterie of sophomores have a lot of stake in this, not least of all the election.
So the Israelis claim that they have arrested IDF. They have arrested Hamas fighters who threw their weapons down. The Gazans say these are not Hamas fighters. These are civilians who've been kidnapped, stripped down to their underwear, and paraded around on Israeli cameras, an express violation. Well, the kidnapping is a violation of the Geneva Convention, so the occupier can't kidnap, and the parading is a violation. This morning earlier today, I asked Alistair Crook about it. So we have juxtaposed Alistair's comments on this with background footage, what we call B-roll, of these unfortunate guys being shown on camera in their underwear. They're a little blurred. It's not lurid. It looks like they're wearing bathing suits, but it's a war crime. Take a look.
It's becoming quite clear that actually Hamas is not being defeated. I mean, when you see Israel rounding up a whole lot of civilians from a local shelter in their underwear and then filming them and say they're sort of seized Hamas prisoners, you realize that Israel is having to try and find ways of convincing its public that this exercise has been a success. I don't think they have even touched the main force of Hamas, which is underground still. They've just managed to treat it a little bit at the edges, but not the main part of it. And at the same time, they've destroyed their image in the world overall, completely. But Biden is committed to giving them as much time as possible to try and destroy Hamas. But meanwhile, as I say, I think Hamas understood this. They are able to last much longer than perhaps Biden or Netanyahu is in this fight. And then I think that they expect that Israel will go for Hezbollah. And that will mean we will move up the ladder of escalation to the next level.
Interesting observation that Hamas will be around longer than Biden or Netanyahu. Why is there no outrage at this? You expressed profound outrage. We ran the clip over and over the weekend. Why aren't people in the State Department resigning and publishing the documents, showing, demonstrating United States duplicity in Ukraine and in Israel? But there would be outrage anywhere else in the world of any other country. If Putin stripped down Ukrainian prisoners to their underwear and took pictures of them, there'd be outrage.
That would be different because he wants to take over Europe. I make a joke, sick joke.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is, look, I'm around long enough to remember photos of Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Dachau, and those photos are very reminiscent of what happened then, okay? So never again, except for the Israelis. They can do never again what happened to them. Now, these photos are going viral around the rest of the world. You don't see them on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. There have been some little improvement in that, but that hasn't happened yet. So it's really up to us. We are enabling all this stuff. We have to tell our representatives, our senators, and anybody else who has any power at all, look, that's enough is enough. Never again means never again for everyone, especially for people who have suffered never again.
Over the weekend, the Biden administration, bypassing Congress, sent 13,000 rounds of tank ammunition and another 106 million in tanks and tank spare parts to Israel, bypassing Congress, using emergency legislation enacted at the time of World War II. The purpose of the emergency legislation is to defend the national security of the United States of America. So in order to bypass Congress, it was necessary for Secretary Blinken to sign a document under oath that whatever he was bypassing Congress on was necessary to support the national security of the United States. Is it even conceivable how giving this money to Israel, bypassing Congress, bypassing the Constitution, bypassing federal law, is necessary for the security of the United States?
It's not conceivable. It is conceivable if Biden thinks this is necessary for him to win the election, or the people around him think that's the case. It's so politically cynical.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
You this week posted something about an interesting figure, $41,000. What was that $41,000 in reference to?
Yeah, so that's new data from the Social Security Agency, and that is their tally for the median income for American workers. In other words, half of American workers make less than that, 41,000, and that comes out to about $3,400 a month. Now, once you take the median rent in the United States is about $2,000. The median car payment for a used car is about $542, I think. Once you're done with that, you've got about $892 left, and you've got to do your groceries, your gasoline, the car repairs, the health insurance, clothes, any kind of sick kids. You've got to cover all of that with $892. And so I'm sympathetic to Gene that in many ways life is much better than it was in the past. But at the same time, point one is that a lot of people, I think, are genuinely struggling. This is not just lazy millennials. This is literally, they are in a spot where they can essentially only dream of the lifestyle that they themselves grew up in, right? So they might have grown up in a 4-bedroom house with, that their parents owned. And when they look at that now and they're, getting into their 40s, they're with the roommates, they're eating ramen, that's just a complete science fiction outcome for them. They can't imagine getting there. They're light years from starting a family. And so, yes, we have iPhones, we have internet, we have all kinds of technological innovation because the rest of us innovate, even as the government tries to stop it. But at the same time, the question is, have we lost that sort of American dream trajectory where each generation is much, much wealthier than their parents, right? To the point where the parents look at the kids and say, I can't imagine what an amazing world you live in. We couldn't imagine that. We had to go uphill both ways in the snow. All right. And that has now become today where you've got 30 somethings who are dreaming nostalgically of the luxurious lifestyle in which they grew up.
I saw, and in fact, I think I might have it open in one of my tabs here from a few months ago. This is on CNBC. Headline, 63% of workers unable to pay a $500 emergency expense.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? How do people, you're on the edge of catastrophe at all times. And that has to take a toll on you mentally.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the amazing thing, of course, so I was living in Taiwan for about 5 years. And what's interesting about Taiwan is that the average household wealth in Taiwan, I believe, is actually substantially higher than it is in the US. Now, Taiwan is a much poorer country. So why is that? And I would argue that the reason is because the safety net in Taiwan is not nearly as complete or as generous as it is in the US. And so what ends up happening is, in Taiwan, for example, if you lose your job, people don't ask if you're going to go on government benefits, right? People ask, well, what kind of business are you going to start in the meantime? Okay, the assumption is that you're going to go down and rent a food cart. All right, you're going to take that out somewhere. You can pay rent to find a spot in these night markets, very cheap. You'll pay $50 to get a sign made, and you'll be up and running that evening, earning income whilst you look for a job during the day. Okay, it's a completely different mentality. Whereas I think the $500, right, the fact that in a nation this wealthy, that 63% cannot afford I mean, people are like driving on the edge of the cliff all the time. And I think a big reason for that is the safety net, right? It is that we've created moral hazard where people do not save enough. They spend way up to the limit. They figure they'll just go on credit and then something will happen. So yeah, I think without a doubt. And of course, the upshot for policy is that any politician who would propose some of the sort of tough medicine type policies, Jim Grant talks about in The Forgotten Depression, the sort of standard recession response back in the 19th century. Anybody who talks like that, you are going to have the media trolling up millions of people who are suffering, those exact people who are living right on the edge. And at that point, there is going to be no tolerance in the public conversation for discussions about personal responsibility. People are going to think, well, okay, sure, in the abstract, we can talk about that when the recession is over. And so the end result is that every crisis, I think, it grows. You have this ratchet effect that is much larger than it would be if we didn't have such an expansive welfare state.
All right, so the welfare state contributes in some way. But if somebody said to you, all of this struggling that we're doing goes to show that the system doesn't work, you might well agree with them because it depends on what you mean by the system. But what they mean by the system is quote unquote capitalism, and capitalism doesn't work. But the thing is that historically, for hundreds of years, capitalism, the result of it has been to bring, thinking in terms of purchasing power, the price of everything more and more within the reach of ordinary people. So why would the system suddenly reverse course? So how would you defend the market economy that you and I believe in?
Right. So capitalism, of course, means different things to different people. So the left uses it to mean the, sort of perfect free market, orthodoxy, every man for himself, the law of the jungle. And I think as Austrians, we understand that, if we're talking about the current system, that is, of course, a mixture. It is an enormous amount of government interference. Government at all levels spends about half of all the spending in the American economy. If you add on what's regulated, what's mandated, I mean, we are a mostly socialist system. And
came to how a free people should respond to government usurpation. So usurpation is a theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states today. The people are the source of all power. So whatever the setup is, when government goes beyond its limits, it's stealing, and it shouldn't be doing that. But what do you do about it? Do you go to the government and just try to convince the government to stop doing what the government wasn't supposed to do in the first place? Well, for a very moderate guy like Dickinson, certainly that was the first step. But you don't stop at the first step if the first step doesn't work, because government isn't sovereign. Government doesn't have final say over the people. So he said citizens, this is not a quote, but citizens, this is from an article by Rob Nailson, The Message of the Farmer Letters, citizens should oppose small usurpations immediately to prevent them from acquiring the force of precedent. For people like Dickinson and so many others of the old revolutionaries, precedent was the great problem. And Thomas Jefferson talked about this years later in his opposition to the so-called constitutionality of the National Bank in 1791, saying that if you take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution, you allow them to do that, then the rules don't matter. You've basically given them a boundless field of power, is how Jefferson put it. So Dickinson also took this position. In one of his letters in the farmer letters, he specifically was pointing out how some people were saying this is not as bad as the Stamp Act, so we shouldn't get too worked up about it. And he's like, no, it's the other way around. And I'm paraphrasing this. Of course, he would be much more eloquent than I. But he's basically saying even the smallest thing is the greatest worry, because that's the one that doesn't bring up all the alarm that the large steps. And each of those small steps establishes a precedent that builds and builds and builds. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, wow, now we're underwater. This thing is really nasty. Things are really bad. And you can see how government doesn't go from, well, what's supposed to be limited to the largest in history in one fell swoop. But he said in a number of letters, so in letters 11 and 12, one, for example, a perpetual jealousy. Now, this is not like a relationship jealousy, but talking about paying attention, like, oh, okay, we're on guard for people who might attack liberty. A perpetual jealousy regarding liberty is absolutely required in all free states. Perpetual, constant, no matter what. Even if you get the people in there that you like, you still have to constantly be on guard, because human nature and the nature of power, the maxims of all through history show that, well, corrupt people go to positions of power, and then power always expands. Even when good guys are in there, they try to use it for good things, but they don't live forever and they don't stay in power forever, and eventually the bad guys get in power. And so you never want to actually advocate for more government power, really, which they did not follow all of their own recommendations, but that's human nature. So perpetual jealousy regarding liberty is absolutely required in all free states. And in letter 12, he said, let us take care of our rights, and we therein take care of our prosperity. Slavery is ever preceded by sleep. So if you have to consider something that is almost never talked about, really, the Quartering Act, or at least the first one in 1765, that came out around the same time. It was given royal assent on May 15th of that year and provided that Great Britain would house its soldiers in American barracks and public houses. I'm not going to get into details on that, but really the end result is what's most important. The back and forth, the resistance, the ramp up by government, the resistance, the ramp up by government just keeps going through this process. When 1,500 British troops, and this is from Wiki, arrived at New York City in 1766, the New York Provincial Assembly refused to comply with the Quartering Act and did not supply billeting for the troops. The troops had to remain on their ships. This is a huge embarrassment to the empire. They're just saying, this local assembly say, we're not going to do what you tell us to do. And mind you, it wasn't just New York. It was circumvented basically in all of the colonies except Pennsylvania, where Dickinson is from, surprisingly, but they were just not participating to various degrees in the enforcement of that. And here from Mike Meharry then, so their follow-up to that, the British then, of course, government always tries to ramp it up. They follow up in 1767. They followed up passing 4 laws together known as the Townshend Acts. These laws imposed new taxes on the importation of paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea, and expanded the British government's power to fight smuggling. They did not like people having a more free market. They liked the regulated market, just like today. They also included something called the New York Restraining Act. And the New York Restraining Act, and I think they were trying to single out New York, because they were trying to make an example of New York for refusing to comply with the Quartering Act. And I think the Quartering Act of 1765 had actually even been repealed shortly after that, or around that time, but they still didn't like the idea of the colonies getting uppity. And we see this happen today. The central government, the former federal government in Washington, D.C., they like to basically take action against states who get out of line. They're always threatening them with something. And this is the way that government works. So they punished New York by basically saying, well, we're not going to allow you to go into session anymore. And this, of course, led to more resistance by the people. And Meharry puts it this way: as with the Stamp Act, published protests led to more concrete actions. And I'm jumping through this just very briefly. But in March of 1768, a committee of Boston merchants drafted a series of resolutions establishing an agreement to stop buying most goods imported from England. They're like, okay, well, if you're going to keep trying to boss us around, we're going to hit you in the wallet, where we know that's the most impact on you people. And finally, Mike writes, on August 1st of 1768, approximately 60 Boston merchants and traders signed an agreement based on resolutions. On those resolutions, only 16 refused to do so. I mean, that was a pretty significant amount, but this was really the beginning of this process of saying, well, we're just not going to participate in a bigger and bigger way. And then we also have down in Virginia, the Virginia Association. George Washington suggested a broad non-importation agreement in response to the Townshend Acts. He suggested it to George Mason, who worked with Richard Henry Lee, and they drafted one up. And here's, for example, a little bit from this as well. They will not at any time hereafter directly or indirectly import or cause to be imported any manner of goods, merchandise, or manufactures which are or shall hereafter be taxed by act of Parliament for the purpose of raising a revenue in America. So they're just saying, if you're going to try to tax us, we won't do that business anymore, because you don't deserve to get that money. It's illegal for you to do it, and we're going to starve the beast until we can get back to normal.
This first clip, this is essentially what we're talking about. This was on Hedge. Plenty of stories out there about this, but this was on Thursday. Jews genocide and how the universities were lost. He says, for decades, our elite institutions and media have treated free speech as increasingly dangerous. As Alex Berenson highlights in an excellent summary, they have used their power to put topics off limits, especially those that expose racial differences. Like most evil, censorship metastasizes. Universities now police even the smallest offenses against minority or self-declared marginalized groups. Now go to the next one. This has that picture that you like, Dr. Paul, of those university presidents, of Ivy League university presidents there being grilled excuse me, before Congress. And the article goes on talking about the rot that's out there on campus. Last year, Harvard declared misgendering. That is referring to transgender people that pronoun their actual birth gender as a form of abuse. The year before, Columbia had declared it a fireable offense. This attitude, this context, to use the word heard frequently on Tuesday, which is last Tuesday when the hearing took place, is what makes Tuesday's congressional testimony by three presidents of elite American universities so shameful, fraught, and hypocritical. So this is a cultural rot. This is a rot that's been going on a long time, and to a degree, it was exposed in the hearings last week. But the real question is, what were the motives behind the exposition of this? Is there any hypocrisy involved, and what's the way out? I think.
Yes, and they asked the question about who should regulate this, because they're talking about speech. What can you say, what you can't say? And I think they have an impossible task. And I've often said this. And I was even thinking about grade school and high school when they might have dressing codes. Who does it? You wouldn't have it. You want to protect civil liberties. At the same time, you don't want to have people not acting civilized. So you have to have some rules. And I struggled with that. And the only thing I could come up with is the entity that's closest to the management. If we have the government, it's the local community, but not the UN or the federal government or the state government even. And that would be the way to handle this. But right now, if you're going to control speech, you have to ask what speeches would be controlled and how do you do it. And I don't think it's possible to take all these universities and have a code of conduct. They might just want to tinker with that, and I think what we're witnessing now is this tinkering around and government involvement and philosophers' involvement for all these years. And you would think of the deterioration since 1913. The universities have been the instigators of all this. But I think what is happening right now is a conclusion of this effort, because I make the analogy frequently to economics, because in economics they've been tinkering since the progressive era, and we still have a monster system, and people are just waiting for it to collapse. And in a way, this is a social thing. They're waiting for this to collapse, and it will. But it's to me, people don't understand the First Amendment. People don't have people have really rights of free speech if you own your property. If it's somebody's church or somebody's home, you're not going to have a government agent at the door. They might try to, especially if you're broadcasting or something. They want to invade and take care of it. But they want to come in and regulate that. But most people understand, no, we don't want the government doing this, and we don't want the government taking control of the speech in the First Amendment. But the whole thing is that's what they think they should do. But I think what we should do is just wean ourselves off this absolute dependency on the government. And I think whoever puts the money in has a say-so, and it's the taxpayers, it's the politicians, and then they come up with all this wokeism. And it's just their tool. I mean, that's an army set up of people who believe in wokeism. And wokeism is not a nice system. I think it is contrary to the principles of liberty. I think it's contrary to common sense. And it's the last thing that we need. And yet they're riding a high horse right now, and they're doing well. But the reason I think this picture, especially that we looked at, I think it's so interesting because they have some sour faces there, and they good. And that system should get some sour faces too, because I've had my kids go to state universities and all, and I remember one of them coming up and he says, "Dad, my teacher that teaches me economics is a declared communist." So how do you handle that? When it's government, it's harder to do it. But if it was in our private school or my homeschooling group, I'll tell you what, we have the right and the obligation to regulate it, and we regulate speech through voluntarism and through property rights.
Yeah, that's all we can do. Well, the last one is more of an update, but it's actually kind of news, which is tomorrow, believe it or not, Dr. Paul, and this is going to shock you, guess who's back in town? Not Santa Claus coming to town. No, Zelensky. It's a reverse Santa Claus, right? Instead of giving you stuff, he takes stuff. So believe it or not, now we've been talking about this on the show for a while, that the Biden administration is getting desperate. Last week, I don't know if you saw this, but Tucker Carlson tweeted out that a source of his in Congress told him that in a closed-door meeting, Secretary of Defense Austin told members of Congress, if you don't vote this money for us, we're going to send your kids and your family and your nephews out to fight in this war, a real threat. And Biden has been essentially saying the same thing. He said, if Ukraine doesn't win, American troops will be fighting Russia in Europe. And they've been also talking about the domino theory. Putin, when he finishes with Ukraine, is going to take over Berlin. He's going to take over London, Amsterdam. He's going to town. He's going to be over here soon. They've been going full court press to try to get this money.
The saddest thing that I come across looking at all this and seeing this activity is that so much harm and killing and waste and suffering and starvation all could be prevented. It's not like we don't know what does it, but there's so much greed in the country where people want to make money on this, and they go along with this, and it to me is such a tragedy. One tragedy I see that I really am annoyed by is when I see the handicapped veterans coming back.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, they're making it. They're heroic in them not giving up. But it's so criminal because how about the people that died, the civilians that died, the people who are suffering now without their limbs or blinded and stuff like that. And I thought it could have all been prevented.
Yeah.
This was not, this didn't fall out of the sky. People created this monster.
Aristotle was born in 384 BC in Stagira in Thrace, a colony in northern Greece. And he is often called the Stagirite after his birthplace. At the age of 18, he came to Athens and entered Plato's academy. Remember, the first university in the Western world. He studied under Plato for about 20 years, until Plato's death. And during most of those years, Aristotle, judged by the evidence that we have available, was a wholehearted Platonist. He believed in the world of forms. He believed in the immortality of the soul, in the wheel of birth. He believed that death was a release from the body where the soul was unable to go back to the perfect, unchanging world. He believed that knowledge was reminiscence, etc. And he wrote a number of Platonic-type dialogues in this period expounding these typical Platonist themes. But Aristotle was not only a student of Plato, he was also Aristotle. And he came gradually to question, one issue at a time, to question and to reject Plato's views, developing finally his own philosophy in fundamental opposition to Plato's. In 335 BC, he opened his own university in Athens in direct competition with Plato's. And his was called the Lyceum. And since he characteristically instructed the students by strolling back and forth with them in a covered walk called the Peripatos, he is frequently called the peripatetic philosopher, or the peripatetic philosophy means Aristotelianism. Now, during his years at the school, he wrote an incredible number of treatises for his students on all subjects then known and many which had not been known in which he started. He was one of the very few universal geniuses in human history. His works encompass physics, metaphysics, logic, epistemology, ethics, psychology, biology, rhetoric, theology, politics, aesthetics, etc. Unfortunately, today, much of his writing has been lost. Only a fraction of his work remains, and yet what we have fills 12 volumes. Now, a word on his writings, if you ever want to read them. Almost all of his works that he wrote for the general public have been lost. And what we have today is largely notes which we conjecture he made for himself and his pupils and had not intended for publication. And indeed, some people take the view, and there is a certain plausibility to it, that the works we have are written by Aristotle's students. They represent, in effect, class notes, which were later compiled and ascribed to Aristotle. In any event, the works are terse, telegrammatic, highly technical, difficult to read. Moreover, after centuries of confusion, various people have added various bits to them, pasting them usually in the midst of a completely different subject and treatise. The order got all mixed up, and so, for instance, elements of Aristotle's early Platonism periodically pop up in a mature work, and it makes hash out of the total volume. Generally, therefore, do not blame yourself if you find Aristotle difficult to untangle or read. It is not your fault, and it is not his fault. It does have the effect that Aristotle is particularly difficult to interpret in several cases because of the fragmentary, elusive nature of what we have. And in those cases, insofar as they're relevant to this course, although my presentation will be generally the standard presentation, I will indicate where other possibilities of interpretation exist. All right, let us begin with Aristotle's thought. And our first subject this evening will be Aristotle's epistemology. But as a preface to it, I must acquaint you with the essentials of his metaphysics as a base to understand his epistemology. Now, the fundamental principle of Aristotle's metaphysics I've already given you. There is one reality, this reality, the world we live in. That is contrasted with the sophistic view. Aristotle believed that reality is objective, it's absolute, it is what it is, independent of consciousness, independent of the thoughts, the hopes, the wishes of anybody or everybody. And of course, in contrast to Plato, it is anti-supernaturalistic. It's sometimes called naturalism, a dubious word, but if you understand its meaning, as meaning only that there is this reality and no supernatural world, no world of forms or of universals. The arguments Aristotle offers against the sophists we'll see in due course.
President Biden recently repeated the claim that high prices are caused by greedy businesses. Biden is not alone in trying to gaslight the people into thinking price inflation is rooted in the actions of private individuals and not the fiat money system Americans have lived with since 1971. In the media, we see excessive consumer spending on luxury items, for example, being blamed for continued price inflation. The fact is that increased consumer demand can only cause prices to rise in those sectors of the economy subject to the increased demand. Prices increasing across the economy are always the result of the Federal Reserve's conduct of monetary policy. Trying to minimize the harm of inflation, some people in government and media will insist that while many prices for goods are higher than they were pre-lockdown, they are still lower than they were in the 1990s when you consider that the quality of these goods has increased. The argument is that buyers are getting higher value today than 30 years ago. Of course, any increased quality is because of market-driven innovation. If America had a free market monetary system instead of central bank-controlled fiat currency, prices would drop as quality increases. It's also important not to ignore the fact that the Federal Reserve's devaluation of the dollar's purchasing power creates an incentive for individuals to spend money as soon as they receive it, and a disincentive for them to save. This is because the dollar will have less value a year from now than today. Therefore, high levels of spending are a rational response to an irrational fiat money system. High prices and supply shortages were inevitable after the lockdowns. However, prices would have adjusted back more if the Federal Reserve had not pushed interest rates to zero. While the Fed has raised interest rates, it has not raised rates to anywhere near where they would likely be in a free market. In fact, rates are not at historically high levels, yet many worry the Fed's rate increases are pushing the economy toward a recession. This shows how addicted Americans are to the Fed's easy money. When the dollar's purchasing power erodes, workers will seek higher wages. This is why periods of high price inflation are accompanied by strikes and other types of union activity aimed at increasing wages. This has made unions another popular scapegoat for price inflation, when the truth is that Fed-caused price increases are the real reasons behind labor unrest. Sadly, the increase in nominal wages gained by the recent series of strikes is unlikely to keep up with the declining real wages resulting from the Federal Reserve's assault on the dollar's value. This is why, contrary to the claims of many progressives, working people are the victims, not the beneficiaries, of price inflation. As a Texas union official once told me, gold has always been the friend of the worker. This makes sense because gold is money whose value cannot be manipulated by the central bank. Inflation is the act of money creation by the Fed, and high prices are a symptom of inflation, not a cause, and not the fault of greedy business, consumers, and unions. The Federal Reserve is also the engine of the welfare warfare state. Therefore, to restore a system of limited government, individual liberty, and free markets, Congress must cut spending and audit, then end the Fed. Thanks for listening.
So Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on Monday rejected international pressure for a ceasefire in Gaza and signaled that the brutal assault will continue for months or even longer. So in just over 2 months of Israel's campaign in Gaza, that's as long as it's been, 2 months and a few days, at least 18,000 Palestinians have been killed, including over 7,000 children. The number of wounded is very high. Over 49,000 people have been injured. And the casualty numbers are from Gaza's health ministry. They're considered to be a low estimate because they're not accounting for the people trapped under the rubble, the bodies, and the people that are still alive. On top of the massive death toll from Israel's airstrikes and ground operations, health services in Gaza have collapsed, and that's due to these Israeli attacks on hospitals. They're laying siege to hospitals, and just the Israeli siege on Gaza in general, a lack of fuel accounts for a lot of the hospitals having to close, having to shut down. Palestinians are also facing severe food shortages, so if this thing does continue for months and months, we will start seeing people dying from hunger and disease. Doctors Without Borders said on Monday that its employees in southern Gaza have seen, quote, the complete collapse of healthcare services in the area, along with the rest of the healthcare system in Gaza, end quote. So these horrific scenes that are coming out of Gaza have prompted more calls for peace and negotiations, but the U.S. has not been phased as it continues to provide unconditional military support, and they vetoed that resolution at the UN Security Council. So back to Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, he told the Associated Press on Monday that it would take time speaking about Israel's operations in Gaza, and he suggested that the current phase of the war, which involved constant airstrikes and heavy ground fighting, will last for weeks, and that further military action against what he called pockets of resistance would continue for months. And then Hanegbi, who's the Israeli National Security Advisor, he made similar comments, saying that the time it will take to achieve Israel's goals in Gaza, quote, cannot be measured in weeks, and I'm not sure it can be measured in months, end quote. So suggesting this thing could, last for a year or longer. And there was a Financial Times report recently that said that Israeli officials expect this thing to last for over a year. Zelensky arrived in the U.S. on Monday and pleaded for more military aid in a speech at the National Defense University in Washington, where he was introduced by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. So Zelensky said, quote, Ukrainians haven't given up and won't give up. We know what to do, and you can count on Ukraine, and we hope just as much to be able to count on you, end quote. So Zelensky's visit comes as the White House is pressuring Congress to pass that massive $111 billion spending bill that includes over $60 billion for Ukraine, and the idea is to fund the war for another year. The White House has said that if Congress does not authorize the funds, the U.S. will run out of money for the war. Zelensky said, quote, every one of you here understands for a soldier to wait for munitions, waiting for weeks, months without knowing if support will come at all. Every one of you with command experience knows what it means when, instead of moving forward, you're just watching, waiting for armor or equipment while your enemy is satisfied and preparing for assaults, end quote. So despite Ukraine's failed counteroffensive, Zelensky is determined to continue the war, even as his top general has said Ukrainian forces cannot break through Russian defenses, and Ukraine is facing a manpower shortage. Aides close to Zelensky have said in comments to Time magazine that he is deluding himself into thinking Ukraine can win the war. Doesn't matter to Biden, Blinken, Sullivan. They just want to keep this thing going. So Zelensky will meet with Biden on Tuesday and is set to hold talks with House Speaker Mike Johnson on the same day, and he's going to meet with senators to make his pitch. And as things stand now, Republicans are still looking for concessions from Democrats on the border issues. They want changes to the asylum laws. So we'll see how all of that plays out. As the Biden administration is looking for all this money, a poll has found that nearly half of American voters think the U.S. is spending too much on the conflict. So this poll was conducted by Financial Times and Michigan Ross, found that 48% of respondents believe the U.S. was spending too much on military and financial aid to Ukraine, while 27% said the U.S. was spending the right amount, and just 11% believe Washington should be spending more. So just 11% think they should be spending more. That means only 11% of the people responding to this poll think that Congress should authorize this over $60 billion. And Republicans are more opposed to the U.S. spending on the war. 65% said the U.S. was doing too much, compared with 52% of independents and 32% of Democrats. So these results do not bode well for Zelensky. Unfortunately, I do think the hawks in Congress are still determined to get this funding. So I won't be surprised if they do get it. And this poll also actually posed the same question about U.S. spending on military aid for Israel since October 7th and found similar results, slightly more support for sending more to Israel. But the poll found 40% of respondents believed the U.S. was spending too much, while 30% said the U.S. was spending the right amount. Several polls now have shown that the majority of American voters favor a ceasefire in Gaza, which has been rejected by the Biden administration. Another one from Kyle. And this is about Jack Teixeira, the U.S. Air National Guardsman who allegedly leaked the Discord leaks. Some of that stuff revealed, one thing that those leaks revealed is that the U.S. did not think Ukraine could regain much territory in the counteroffensive, but they pushed for it anyway. So that was a pretty big leak. But they, I know this investigation, they determined that Teixeira acted alone, but they relieved his commanding officer because they're saying he should have raised the alarm after he was informed that Teixeira was seeking information that was outside the scope of his position. And airmen working night duty like Teixeira had ample opportunity to access classified sites and print a high volume of products without supervision or detection. That's what this report said. And in total, 15 Air National Guardsmen, including the commander, received some form of discipline over the Teixeira leaks. So saying that basically the people around him should have known something was up and should have done something to stop it. And he was posting these classified documents onto Discord, onto a server that he had with his friends that he made. He's a young guy. He made friends online during the pandemic. I believe, if I remember his story correctly, his last year of high school was locked down, which is something I can't imagine, being that young and having to deal with that. And then, he made friends online, and it seems like he was trying to impress them by posting these classified documents. Allegedly, that's what he's being accused of by the U.S. government.
At MIT, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate MIT's code of conduct or rules regarding bullying and harassment? Yes or no? You've targeted individuals, not making public statements. Yes or no? Calling for the genocide of Jews does not constitute bullying and harassment? I have not heard calling for the genocide of Jews on our campus. But you've heard chants for intifada. I've heard chants, which can be anti-Semitic depending on the context, when calling for the elimination of the Jewish people. So those would not be according to the MIT's code of conduct or rules. That would be investigated as harassment if pervasive and severe.
Let's pause it for a second there. I'm sorry. So it's MIT, UPenn, and Harvard. So Rob, I see you smiling already. So I'm sorry. It's hard. Listen, I do understand. Here's the thing I want to express going into this. There is so much ridiculousness and hypocrisy on all sides of this that it just shows you how bad. It's like, wow, how have we fallen to this level as a society? This one to me feels like one of the biggest. This feels like one of the biggest moments in the battle for free speech. And a lot of people maybe won't like this. And, that's the thing about free speech. You don't necessarily like what people are saying with it. But it feels to me like a really, really big deal that Alex Jones is back on Twitter. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I love it. I mean, it was crazy. That was the first sign of the tech censorship, was they all took him off the internet at the exact same time. And I'm not, you might be surprised with my interest in conspiracy theory. He's not a guy I ever really listened to. He became more of an internet sensation, I think, after being canceled. For the most part, I don't follow him. I listened to half that Tucker interview and I was shocked to hear, I was like, oh, these are mostly opinions I have in terms of, what the World Economic Forum and others are trying to do. So I guess is more, the ideas he's putting out there now don't seem to be too far away from my current perspective. But yeah, just the fact that you got Twitter being more of a free speech absolute place, that even people with reprehensible opinions or people that have gotten things very wrong or offended or otherwise, I think I prefer the paradigm of free speech in an absolute.
Well, yes, I agree with you on that. I'll say this. I think that Alex Jones got some things wrong at Elon Musk, and fair enough, but he was questioning Alex Jones today about Sandy Hook and what he got wrong about that. And, there were things where people would question him about what he got wrong. And I think it's totally reasonable to hold him responsible for what he got wrong. But if you're going to hold him responsible for what he got wrong, then it seems to me that what would be fair would be to also credit him for what he got right. And what he got right was a lot. Now, and this is the issue with Alex Jones. You can't take away what he got right. And this is a guy who predicted 9/11 before 9/11 happened. And even, I think, predicted that it would be the World Trade Center. And this guy got, if you want to talk about what he got right over the last 20 years, I'll tell you what he got right was every war. Every war he was against. Totally against the war in Iraq, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, all of them. He was totally against them. Joe Rogan, who's a mutual friend of mine and Alex Jones, the reason why this is what Joe has said publicly many times, so I'm not giving anything away that he's told me privately, but one of the things or one of the main reasons why Joe Rogan really respects Alex Jones, and he said this, is because Alex Jones told Joe Rogan about Epstein Island over a decade ago, when no one else, way before any of us knew about this. He told him, he goes, there's this guy, Jeffrey Epstein, and he brings all the powerful people to this island where they rape children and blah, 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 and had this whole thing laid out. And so I'm just like, hey, if you want to knock him for what he got wrong, fine, but you got to also give him credit for what he got right. It's not fair to do one, but not the other. So there's that. But anyway, the reason why I think Elon Musk bringing Alex Jones back onto Twitter is such a big deal is because, as you kind of alluded to, Rob, this was the biggest cancellation attempt. This was, it was up there. There's a few that you could mention. Alex Jones being booted off of all the major platforms in clear coordination within a very short period of time was a big one. The cancellation attempt of Joe Rogan was a big one, and that failed. The Alex Jones one seemed to have succeeded. Look, the Andrew Tate cancellation was a big one, and that seems to have failed. And now with Alex Jones coming back, it's almost like, it seems like that one failed too. And that's a really big deal. The canceling people thing used to really work. And there's lots of examples where it's worked. Lots of people have been canceled from, corporate press positions where they're not relevant the way they used to be. Okay. But the biggest ones in the last couple of years have totally failed. And Rogan, Andrew Tate, those were big ones. They totally failed. They just got bigger after this big attempt to cancel them. Alex Jones was one that seemed like it succeeded. And now he's been brought back. And not only has he been brought back, but on this Twitter Spaces today, he said that he's bringing his show to Twitter. And you see Tucker Carlson, who was the biggest guy in cable news, was fired from Fox News and brought his show to Twitter and got even bigger than he was. And now Alex Jones is back on Twitter and is, at least it seems, like going to bring his show back to Twitter. And that's crazy. That means that this guy with the most anti-government message, and not just an anti-government message, not, but the best kind of anti-government message, a message that's like, not only should you oppose what the people in Washington, D.C. are doing, but you should be skeptical of them at every turn because there are evil people in there that are plotting against you. That guy went from being denied any platform to being gifted the biggest platform. That's a big deal. I'm pretty interested to see where this goes.
And it's a stamp of approval for free speech.
Yep.
It's saying, hey, no, we're going to live with free speech. And I think the machine has a hard time contending with it because people like truth. They like information. And I think the machine relies on being able to, shorten the scope of available information to you so that, you can pick between two of the same options.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that I think the whole
A not good first move by Zelensky when he got to town. Zelensky says Putin is inspired by the Capitol Hill deadlock on Ukraine. And he said it in an even worse way than that, hence our title, which is that he's claiming that Republicans who are hesitant are inspiring Putin. Now let's listen to Zelensky. Now I would say this, Dr. Paul, in his own words, but you watch him deliver this. We're going to listen to a minute of this. Don't start it quite yet. You watch this and you tell me, now there's a rumor that they've got about 100 PR firms under contract in the D.C. Beltway. So there's a lot of our money going around. You listen to him read this speech very, very badly, and it's not just because he's not a native speaker. He's reading the words of some PR flack who wrote this, especially if you look at the turns of phrase. They're not something a Ukrainian would say. They're absolutely American. They're written by Americans, but they're written badly for him to deliver. And let's listen to him as he insults Republicans and and demeans himself. Here we go. Let's put it up and listen to it. First minute.
Any of you with a son or daughter in combat zone just wouldn't get it if they were told that protecting lives could wait because there's a little more debating. Let me be frank with you, friends. If there's anyone inspired by unresolved issues on Capitol Hill, it's just Putin and his sick clique. They see the dreams come true when they see the delays or some scandals, and they see freedom to fall when the support of freedom fighters go down. And people like Putin shouldn't even hope to conquer freedom. And we can show our children, grandchildren, what real confidence is.
Obviously not written by him. It's written by a PR guy who we pay with our tax dollars. But the message is there. Now, if I'm a Senate Republican, even if I'm kind of like, hey, maybe we should give him some money, this would really irritate me because he says, all this debating, all these scandals, he's probably meaning the corruption scandals in Ukraine, all of these things coming out, it's all your fault. You are just appeasing Putin by doing this. Americans who will watch this guy talk that way to Senator, I don't know. What do you think?
Can I sign a check?
Yeah.
I want to
yeah.
donate money to this guy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a real tragedy. I think what we're witnessing and what's really happening and why the pressure is there. Yeah, there's pressure for Christmas vacations. There's pressure on the budgets. There's pressures on our borders. But I think the big issue is that there's pressure on the American empire.
Yeah.
Because this was a strategy that was designed, by our side, doing things that we didn't do immediately because we were wanting to get a peace dividend. And we did have a peace dividend, but it didn't last very long because after a few years, people got antsy. Well, we need to, the Russians might, get powerful again and invade Europe. So they had to concoct an enemy. So they create their enemy by doing what they're doing. And in a way, though, how foolish this is and how close we are to total bankruptcy, it's going to put some dent into the empire. And I think that's good. I think that eliminates a lot of power from our, military-industrial complex. It removes the power of the secrecy and what goes on in our Federal Reserve System. It puts a dent in this exclusion. I mean, it's so disgusting when they talk about, the Democrats are saying the former president has created an insurrection. Yeah. Well, this is crazy. If you want to see an insurrection, go to the border.
Yeah,
I mean, what did they do? They say, "Oh, we're going to invade you," but okay, we're not going to fight you. We're going to open up the doors and we're going to buy you a hotel room and we're going to take care of you. We're going to feed you. It's total insanity, and the insanity is catching up. Well, with the American people, but I would hope that not only it's a good chance that they won't get their money before the new year, the $60 billion, but let's just hope and pray they don't get it, and it puts a damper on trying to admit the truth. The truth is they've lost the war over there.
Yeah, everyone knows it.
And that means that you love Hitler, that you love Putin, and therefore you have to, be stopped because you're unpatriotic. And but I think there's a big change going on, and some of it could be very positive, but somebody has to fill the vacuum. And of course, we do our best to try to describe what it would be like if we had a republic effort, and try to restore the principles of a republic. But we have a long way to go. Although there's been inroads, there's more people talking about it and they understand it. But right now, I think the deep state and wokeism is when you look at what's going on in our universities. That to me was a wake-up call. Wokeism. Look at the results of wokeism in our universities.
Michael Tracy tweeted this. Zelensky met with U.S. arms manufacturers yesterday in D.C. Here he is pictured alongside executives from Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and others. Looks like many lucrative business opportunities are still ahead for these valued partners. He actually here is doing the quiet part out loud. He's meeting with these delighted weapons manufacturers who are billions of dollars richer because of this war. And I think, Dr. Paul, that is why there's this last-ditch effort. The people you see in that picture are terrified that the spigot will be turned off, because that spigot is their enormous wealth that continues to flow into these people at the expense of us.
We have to hang on to the picture, because I do at least, I get questions. Who are these people? Who's in the deep state? Who has the control? Yeah. And I try not to say, well, I have the names of the 12 people. There are about 12 people there. They're pretty prime members of the deep state. But I think it's a little bit more complex than that. But there is a deep state, and they represent it. And they've been elusive. But here, this picture is something else. And they're not even shy, about this. In the past, I think they assumed that the American people would, if we're making profits, remember progressive Democrats used to frown on the military-industrial complex making money.
Yeah.
But now they're part of it.
They love it. Yeah.
So there's a lot of things going on there. So I think that's a great picture, and people should look at that and say, "Are you serious?"
Yeah.
And somebody add up how much money each one of those companies get. Have gotten over the last 10 years or something, and it's into the many billions of dollars.
Yeah. He's their cash cow. That's what
and also what they spent it on was weapons. Well, that's national defense. That's a lot of baloney.
Yeah.
We don't get blown up in spite of ourselves, but we blow up a lot of other people, and we cause a lot of other people to go to war, and we have our side, and they have their side, and yet we're on both sides sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
As long as you can keep producing the weapons. Right now, they're not worried about having used up all these weapons, because they're going to be, the manufacturers are back at it again. And they're going to cry about, oh, we're in trouble now, and you better subsidize us. But the whole effort is subsidies and support for a principle that's completely wrong.
Yeah.
As for Plato's world of forms, his works contain a repeated polemic against them. I'll give you just a sample, some of his many arguments attacking Plato's world of forms. These arguments will help you get the flavor of Aristotle's approach to philosophy. Well, to begin with, he says, the forms are a useless theory because they do not explain this world. This world in which we live is a world of particular things which move and change and develop. How are we going to explain the events of this world by reference to another world which is defined as static, motionless universals? And yet this is the world we want to understand, and this is the world we need to understand, not some other world. To forms, therefore, he argues, Plato's supernatural world is a useless duplication. Down here we have shoes, ships, and cabbages, and Plato's idea of making sense of it is to say, and besides that, there's another world of shoeness, shipness, and cabbagehood. Well, that is senseless, says Aristotle. And again, if Plato tries to reply to that by saying, well, yes, the forms do help us understand this world, because after all, this world somehow reflects the forms, Aristotle says, your answer is unintelligible. How does this world reflect the forms? All you use, Plato, he says, is empty metaphors. You say that the forms project out into space, or somehow this world imitates or shares in or participates in the forms, but it's completely unclear what the actual relationship between the two worlds is. In actual fact, you have two sundered worlds without any real connection between them. And then there is the famous third man objection, with no relationship to the third man theme. That argument goes as follows. Plato says that whenever you have two or more things which are similar to each other, then the common denominator exists separately. And the things are similar because they all share in or reflect the same one common denominator, the same one form. So that Socrates, Plato, Plotinus, for instance, are all similar, taking them as examples of men, and they must be similar because there is a manness that they all reflect. Well, says Aristotle, Do Socrates and the form of man have something in common? Are they similar to each other? If not, why do we call them both by the same name and say the form of man and Socrates is a man? Obviously, there must be something similar. But if there is something common to, for instance, Socrates and the form of man, then by Plato's own principle, there must be still another form which they both reflect, and in virtue of which they're both similar. So if Socrates is man one, and the form of man is the second, then there must be a third man, and thus the third man argument. And of course, it goes on to infinity. In other words, he claims the theory of forms leads to an infinite regress. There must be a form for what particulars have in common, and a form for what particulars in the first form have in common, and so on. And this is hopeless. Now, I should say in fairness that Plato himself was the first to raise this objection in his late dialogue to Parmenides, and he had no answer to it, and said that he had no answer. Aristotle simply adds, you have no answer because your theory is hopeless. His major objection to Plato's world of forms is, however, that it's self-contradictory by its very statement. It's a violation of logic by its very statement. Because he says what Plato does is make the universal into a concrete, individual, particular thing. And this, he says, obliterates the whole distinction between the universal and the particular. What is that distinction? By a particular, we mean a self-contained, self-enclosed thing. This, that. A thing which exists in itself. A universal, however, by definition, is what is common to a number of particulars. It's the set of characteristics possessed by many different instances. It therefore can't exist in itself, but only in other things, only in particulars. To say, as Plato does, that the universal is a separate thing, existing as an entity in itself, is to make it a particular thing, which is to make the universal a non-universal, which is directly self-contradictory.
So Biden told donors at a fundraising event, quote, Israel's security can rest on the United States, but right now it has more than the United States. It has the European Union, it has Europe, it has most of the world supporting it. But they're starting to lose that support by the indiscriminate bombing that's taking place, end quote. So despite labeling the Israeli campaign as indiscriminate, Biden said the U.S. will continue to provide military assistance, which involves shipping all these bombs over there, all sorts of military equipment. Biden said, quote, the literal security of Israel as an independent Jewish state is literally at stake, but it is unshakable, our commitment to Israel. We continue to provide military assistance to Israel as it goes after Hamas, end quote. So Biden said that Netanyahu justified his slaughter in Gaza by pointing to U.S. and allied bombings in World War II. And as that story I covered yesterday said, the destruction in northern Gaza is comparable to the most heavily bombed German cities of World War II. That's really incredible. I mean that in a bad way. It's incredible in a horrible way. Biden, so it's just interesting to see Biden say this. So he said, quote, it was pointed out to me that by Bibi that, well, you carpet bombed Germany, you dropped the atom bomb, a lot of civilians died, end quote. So that's what Biden said Netanyahu told him. And Biden said he replied by saying, quote, that's why all these institutions were set up after World War II to see that it didn't happen again, end quote. And Biden added that Israel should also not repeat the same mistakes the U.S. made after 9/11 and said the U.S. should never have fought the war in Afghanistan, which is a pretty interesting thing to hear a president say. That Israel's military has begun pumping seawater into Hamas's vast complex of tunnels in Gaza. And the move to flood the tunnels with water from the Mediterranean Sea is one of several techniques that Israel is using to try to clear and destroy the tunnels. Israeli officials say that Hamas's underground system has been key to its operations on the battlefield. And these U.S. officials speaking to the Wall Street Journal are saying that Israel has not done much damage to the tunnels. And using the seawater, you know, again, there's going to be other ways. They're saying that flooding the tunnels with seawater will take weeks, likely be a weeks-long progress. And some Biden administration officials are concerned that using the seawater could endanger Gaza's fresh water supply. It could also impact farming and things like that. So, again, this is just a report from the Wall Street Journal. I know Biden was asked about it, and his response was, what about the hostages? Or he referred to the hostages. And that is a good question because the hostages are probably down in the tunnels. So flooding them with seawater could definitely put them in danger. So the U.S. is threatening to kill a peace plan for Yemen that was negotiated between the Houthis and the Saudis if the Houthis continue attacking shipping in the Red Sea. which the group has been doing in response to Israel's assault on Gaza. So The Guardian reported that the Houthis and Saudis have reached a peace deal that could satisfy all major parties involved in the conflict. Even the Southern Transition Council, they're a UAE-backed group that wants to see the restoration of North and South Yemen as two separate countries, as they were before Yemen was unified in 1990. So the Southern Transition Council, that's the STC, they want to restore South Yemen, and they want to be, separate South Yemen from North Yemen, which there were two separate countries until 1990. And the territory that the Houthis control is pretty much all of what used to be North Yemen. And so, it sounds like splitting up the countries again could be a deal. I don't really see what the problem is, because you have two groups that control most of the territory who, I don't think mind being separated. So the peace plan has been presented to the UN, but the details have not been disclosed to the public. I was not aware that there was actually kind of a deal that they reached and gave to the UN. According to The Guardian, the agreement involves 3 phases, and a potential U.S. plan to redesignate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization could prevent the first phase from being implemented. The first phase involves depositing money into accounts for the payment of civil salaries for workers in Houthi-controlled areas, and also it would fully open airports and seaports that have been under blockade since 2015. A U.S. terrorist designation would mean that any entity that does business with the Houthis would be subject to U.S. sanctions, making both steps impossible to implement without the parties involved facing penalties. So the White House said last month that it was considering redesignating the Houthis as terrorists in response to the attacks in the Red Sea and the Houthi missile and drone launches toward Israel. The Trump administration labeled the Houthis as terrorists in January 2021. It was kind of a last-minute foreign policy move by Mike Pompeo. He did it despite all these aid groups warning that it would doom the food-deprived Yemenis living in Houthi-controlled areas. The Trump administration did it anyway. Biden came in, and they reversed it pretty quickly. In February 2021, it was reversed. So the Houthis, again, they govern the Yemeni capital of Sana'a and the territory that used to be North Yemen. And it's where 70 to 80% of Yemen's population lives. So it's where most Yemenis live. So kind of criminalizing the delivery of aid to those areas could be very bad, obviously. And civilians in Houthi-controlled territory have faced dire food shortages due to the U.S.-backed Saudi-led war and blockade that started in 2015. According to the UN, the war has killed at least 377,000 people. More than half died due to starvation and disease caused by the siege.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
George Washington said, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." And Ukraine is very fucking foreign. And in your Trends Journal back in 2014, we wrote about the United States overthrow of the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych. Oh, who wrote the article? Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Washington is driving the world to the final war. Ukraine presented a perfect opportunity for Washington to advance its hegemonic agenda. In a speech at the National Press Club last December, meaning December 13th, Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland boasted that Washington had invested $5 billion in Ukraine for the purpose to teach democracy. Stealing more of our fucking money to teach democracy and put in a crime syndicate in the most corrupt country in Europe? Oh, no. Hey, McCain or Kane. Yeah, McCain, Mickey fucking Mouse. According to the Ukrainian people, in the last poll, other than the war, 89% of the people are concerned about corruption in Ukraine. So, Washington goes on to say, the nation which indulges toward another in habitual hatred, like we're taught to hate Iran, we're taught to hate Russia, we're taught to hate Cuba, or an habitual fondness, oh, we love Ukraine, we love Israel, is in some degree a slave. Yep. And that's all we are plantation workers on the global plantation of Slavelandia, run by the fucking arrogant shits in office and the fucking bigs that own everything. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interests. Got that, Kane boy? Oh, yeah, I'm in the military intelligence, which is an oxy-fucking-moron. You guys got no intelligence. You're a bunch of losers. You haven't won a war since World War II. You killed millions of people and stole hundreds of trillions of dollars of our money to do it. Calm down, Celente. Be a fucking sucker. Bend over and take the shit like the rest of them. Washington goes on to say, Kane, a passionate attachment to one nation or another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interests exist. Oh, what are you talking about? If we don't stop those Russians, they're going to take over Europe. Just like the same fucking shit they said when I was a kid, young man, with the Vietnam War. Those dominoes going to keep falling. And infusing into one the enmities of the other, betrays the former into a participation in the quarrels of war of the latter without adequate inducement or justification. Against the insidious vials of foreign influence, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience proves that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of the Republican government. He doesn't mean the Republicans, it's a republic, America. All right? That's George Washington that this clown is bragging about, that will love America to steal hundreds of billions of dollars of our money to give to them to keep murdering people and murdering more people in Gaza as the United States votes against a ceasefire. But again, the General Assembly just voted for a ceasefire just a couple hours ago in the UN, but it means nothing. So here's that thing. This Tim Kaine. President Zelensky spoke to the Senate today about the critical role of American support for Ukraine democracy. Who the fuck are you talking to? What democracy are you talking about? The fucking little prick said there's no presidential election this year. But there's this shit that they throw out that the morons and imbeciles swallow. He stood beneath the portrait of George Washington, who helped birth an American free of domination by a great power, a moving moment. But he didn't read the other stuff about George Washington that I said. And again, we're looking at all the money that America is sending to keep bloodying the killing fields. And it's just going to get much, much worse.
I know is that the future of the world is at stake. If we fail, if Republicans don't get reasonable in the next 24 to 48 hours, Russia is going to march into Ukraine. China is going to be given a green light to invade Taiwan. The world for my children is fundamentally different under that scenario. The United States security is at risk.
Other threats might include hyperbole, hysterical rhetoric designed to prevent you being able to think straight, and it seems also to continue to legitimize the funding of an unwinnable war. Unwinnable. So I don't know why Anthony Blinken is using phrases like win-win.
90% of the security systems we provide has actually been spent here in the United States with our manufacturers, with our production, and that's produced more American jobs, more growth in our own economy. So this has also been a win-win that we need to continue.
What they mean by that is that it's economically been valuable. He's essentially there just admitted that the money for the military aid has remained in the US, generating jobs. That old favourite argument, if you let the billionaire class continue to make money, you might get a few scraps. And now a Christmas message from Joe Biden. Give us more money for our wars, otherwise we're going to start killing your children.
Putin attacks a NATO ally. If he keeps going, and then he attacks a NATO ally, well, we've committed as a NATO member that we defend every inch of NATO territory.
Now listen to this, we're all members of NATO, and there's no way of ever undoing that. There's no way of sort of saying that NATO might be a thing that we don't need anymore, seeing as how the whole thing was just set up to tackle the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist now. But it's sort of giving you all of these premises and promises, but actually, we're on a very narrow bandwidth of potential options. We're in NATO. Could we leave NATO? Shut up. And we've said that we're going to protect all NATO territory. Do we have to do that? Shut up. And Putin definitely going to attack other NATO companies. Is he though? Shut up. So, can we have your money or we're going to kill your children? Bloody hell. Yeah, I mean, if that's the only alternative to a dictatorship, shut up.
Biden's budget director, the head of the OMB, sent a letter yesterday to Speaker Mike Johnson, imploring him to spend more money in Ukraine. And what they said is they want to revitalize our defense industrial base. That's the new acronym, DIB, for the MIC, the Military Industrial Complex. And they sent a list of states that would get money when we spend, money on deadly munitions because they have to be manufactured in Alabama or Ohio or Texas. And so, they're saying the quiet part out loud, that congressmen tend to vote for this stuff because a lot of this federal spending that goes to Ukraine is actually laundered back to the military industrial complex. And in some ways, not very efficiently, but in some ways, it enriches people in their districts and the stockholders, some of whom are congressmen.
Amazing. Now you see why there is such a requirement for censorship, because the way that the media functions now with figures like Tucker on X and other comparable voices, you could just say, do you reckon that these people in Congress owning stocks and shares is influencing them, or their ability to say it's improving their local economies in their states? Do you think that might be a factor other than, of course, this humanitarian motive that we keep hearing so much about on CNN and MSNBC? That is why censorship laws are so important, because you have to starve the media space of the oxygen of opposition. That's what's happening. And believe me, they'll go to extraordinary lengths to shut down dissenting voices. Many thousands have died needlessly in the unnecessary, unwinnable, and increasingly unaffordable war in Ukraine. What a slogan. It's unwinnable. It's unnecessary. It's unaffordable. It's the war in Ukraine. And just to give you some perspective, ringside, here's Vitaly Klitschko. We're turning our own country into Russia. Shut up, you. Get Nancy Pelosi. The financial assistance and energy subsidies the war has cost Europe and the United States totals more than the annual GDP of Maryland. And this at a time when America's own national debt is already 120% of our GDP. These costs might have been worth paying if Ukraine were a democracy, but it's not. Democracies do not ban opposition parties. Although, in America, more and more, if you vote for anyone other than this, get used to that rhetoric, Trump's a dictator. The fact that so many such parties ever existed says something about the level of opposition faced by the Ukrainian nationalist government that came to power after the 2014 revolution. Then, in May of 2022, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law formally banning all these parties. President Volodymyr Zelensky signed the law. The list included the opposition Platform for Life, which had held fully 10% of the seats in parliament. The catalogue of authoritarian abuses is growing in Ukraine and shows little sign of slowing under the guidance of the West's favourite autocrat, Zelensky. It has created a state-controlled church, taken control of all television news, and banned major opposition parties. This far exceeds anything that occurred in recent American or British history. Both of those nations remained fundamentally democratic during war, even a civil war. This latest cancellation of presidential elections in Ukraine destroys any pretense that we are supporting a functioning democracy. It also illustrates to me the important fact that we tend to organise information in a way that's convenient to our agenda. There will be people that just will go, no, but he's having to do that because of this and because of that, because of the other. But I think now, this is the side I'm firmly down on. Whatever is publicly being said by the establishment about the perpetuation of this conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it is ultimately because of US financial interests and globalist interests. And actually, I'm kind of sick of the type of politics where anyone from the left or right or anywhere stands up and says, this is what we should be doing.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
And I'm here to tell you, 1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms. Doesn't matter how many lemmings you get out there on the street begging for them to have their guns taken. We will not relinquish them. Do you understand? And that's why you're going to fail, and the establishment knows, no matter how much propaganda, the Republic will rise again when you attempt to take our guns.
My point is there a line though on free speech at all for you?
For me personally, no.
Nothing?
No, I think that Alex Jones should be able to go on Twitter. If they want him there, then that's fine. They can have him there and he can...
Do you think what he said about the Sandy Hook massacre was justified then?
Justified? Like, he has the right to say it. I don't think it was justified.
I mean, $1.2 billion worth of damages awarded against him for one of the most serious...
The biggest civil suit against an individual in the history of America.
One of the worst defamations, actually, in terms of damages America's ever seen. Damages and defamation is not protected by the First Amendment, and yet you think he was entitled to say it.
I think he had a right to say it.
He had a right to say that a mass shooting that killed 20 young kids was a fake and a hoax, that the parents of the grieving dead were crisis actors. These were statements which he repeatedly made, which led to actual intimidation, harassment, death and rape threats, and people in the street going up to these people and confronting them, these parents. You think all that is fine?
I don't think it's fine. I never said it was fine. I said he has a right to do it.
So you actually think he has a right to do what he did, with the consequences we now know happened?
Yes, basically, a bunch of nutters did do a lot of awful stuff after the fact, but that's basically going down the same route of, remember back in the 90s, they wanted to ban video games and Dungeons and Dragons because they thought it caused violence and devil worship. Or you can't, engage with this type of, media, otherwise it's going to cause X, Y, Z, like rap music causes violence, all that other nonsense. If we're saying, this guy's not allowed to say his conspiracy theories or whatever you want to call them because some crazy guy out there might do something mental, then nobody can talk about anything at all.
3 cheers for Count Decula. Hip hip hooray! Or whatever you guys say over there. He's right. He's obviously right. Was Alex right about what he was saying? No, probably not. Does he have a right to say it? Yes. You bet your ass he does, Piers. You fucking pussy. Yeah, man. Just really think about what it amounts to if you're able to sue or deplatform people who are trying to figure out shit that we don't know for sure. Like, honest to God, you have every newscaster in America repeated the CIA lie that Saddam Hussein had WMDs. And for that, over 1 million innocent Iraqis died. 1 million deaths because of the lies that people like Piers Morgan repeated without a second thought. Should he be charged with, I don't know, accessory to murder, accessory to mass murder, because he did not critically think, because he repeated something that in hindsight ended up being wrong? Because that's the door that this opens up. If Alex Jones can't theorize about a handful of mass shootings in America, which, by the way, there's plenty of reason to think that there are mass shootings in America that could be false flags. Vegas comes to mind. Let's be honest. That Vegas story was fucking bizarre, and we may never know the truth of it. But what came of it? Well, they banned bump stocks, and then that story went away, and we've never really discussed it since. But we don't know what the fuck happened that day. Very unlikely that some professional gambler who played, I think it was video game poker on a computer screen, which is like not a great game to play if you are playing for skill as a professional, right? It's a pretty fucking dumb way to try and make a living. So it looks like the guy was money laundering. It looks like he was laundering wherever he actually got his real revenue through these machines so that then he could clean his cash, because then it's taxable and then you can pay taxes on it and then the government leaves you alone. That's what I think he was doing as a professional gambler. And more than likely, he was a gun runner for the CIA. That's my honest opinion. I don't know it for a fact, but I guess I could be sued for $1 billion for thinking maybe that's what happened, given that the broad narrative about it is complete and utter bullshit. Just seems like completely nonsensical. This dude's responsible for murdering 60 plus people from a fucking a window at the, what was it? I think it was Mandalay Bay. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. And there's a lot more that goes into this that I could spend an entire multiple episodes on breaking all this down. But the point of bringing it up is just to say, if we can't question shit like that, like, I'm not saying that the people that were shot were crisis actors. I think genuinely that 60 plus people were murdered. It's terrible. But I don't think that one dude who was some dude with no track record, no criminal history, who was a professional gambler, who had no motive whatsoever, just did that. I don't buy it. Sorry. I don't. Can I say that? Is it okay if I say that? Can the victims of that event all sue me for trillions of dollars? Because I think that story doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. Does the Sandy Hook story make sense all the way around? In my opinion, no, it doesn't. Could it be exactly what the media has reported? Sure, it might be. I don't know. But I think if you live in a free country, you have to be able to question stories. And I'm not talking about minor stories. I'm talking about major stories that are used as catalysts to try and remove our God-given rights. Not rights that are granted by the government, but rights that are enshrined as being outside of the purview of the government per the Bill of Rights. We have these rights. You can't infringe upon them. But they try to with every single mass shooting. So what does the precedent set do? What does the $1 billion civil judgment against Alex Jones really do? It makes it so that every single talking head out there like me becomes horrified to speak out and question any narrative that has anything to do with a mass shooting. You see that? I mean, this is not a big stretch here. Everybody that's got anything to lose is looking at that judgment going, holy shit. I will never question another shooting as long as I'm alive.
First of all, let's talk about a central bank digital currency. Here in South Carolina, Senate Bill 861 was just filed in the South Carolina Senate and would expressly exclude a central bank digital currency, CBDC, from the definition of money in South Carolina, creating potentially significant roadblocks to its use as such in the states. Similar legislation has already been signed as law in both Indiana. Indiana was first, and then Florida just this year in 2023. Now, in short, the more that states do stuff like this, the more obstacles and lawsuits and just stuff that the feds are going to have to deal with, more pushback. The more that we put roadblocks in their way, the less likely it is that they'll be able to pull this off. And I've got an example at the end of how the financial system, they're trying to use credit cards to basically do surveillance on people who purchase firearms. But by putting roadblocks in the way like this, very similar to this, we've at least been able to put that program on hold. So the more that the feds have to go through to implement, they still might pull it off, but it's less likely they'll do it. That's exactly what James Madison told us in Federalist number 46. So Senate Bill 861 in South Carolina takes a step against a central bank digital currency because we know if no one does anything to oppose it, they are guaranteed going to shove that thing down our throats, no matter what anybody tells you. The only way you can stop it is by doing stuff to try to stop it. A very similar piece of legislation was filed in Missouri just at the beginning of this month, Senate Bill 826. So it also removes, if it passes, it would remove a central bank digital currency from the definition of money. And therefore, Missouri would be saying, well, you can't use it as money within the state. Well, there's no contractual requirements, whatever. We're not going to enforce it in court, etc. But from Mike Meharry's report on this, the legislation would go a step further than other states with an additional provision to prohibit a state or local government agency from accepting CBDC as payment. It would also prohibit any public entity from participating in a test of a CBDC by the Federal Reserve, because of course they're going to go through a testing process, and the less organizations, and the less states, and the less governments that participate, and the less people that decide to use it, ultimately this all gets down to the people. If the people go along with this in large numbers, then nothing's going to stop it. Again, it gets down to, first of all, the people have to refuse to participate, refuse to comply, and then the actions of the states have some or more impact. So Senate Bill 826 was filed in Missouri, and that's efforts to stop states from participating in the enforcement of federal gun control. The number of federal gun control measures that should exist under the Constitution is 0. That includes the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 1968, and everything since, of course, the Undetectable Firearms Act, etc., etc. And the ATF has only about 3,700 employees throughout the country. The record amount of enforcement actions that they've been able to complete is somewhere between 10 and 11,000 per year. That's 10 to 11,000 too many. But if you think of it this way, if there's 13 million undocumented short-barreled rifles, all in so-called violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934, which shouldn't exist, the ATF shouldn't exist, well, there's no way they're going to be able to do anything about it. So the more that states opt out of doing enforcement actions for the ATF, because almost every ATF enforcement action is in conjunction with state and local law enforcement, oftentimes with the DEA as well, the less that they participate, the more that it is likely that the people and the states can win. So in Ohio, there are a number of states that have taken action along these lines, pushing the ball forward. The big one, of course, that most people know about is Missouri. It's a very complex law, so it landed in court. We don't want it to go in court, so that's the most effective one. I think in practice, there's also Montana, Kentucky, Arizona, and in some small steps, Idaho, but you have to keep pushing forward. You can't just rest once you get step 1 done. You got to keep pushing forward. So hopefully we'll see more from those states. But in Ohio, House Bill 51, also the Second Amendment Preservation Act, modeled after Missouri, but with some updates and changes in the legal language to make it less likely to have to go through a court case, would ban state and local law enforcement officers from enforcing, attempting to enforce, or participating in the enforcement of any federal acts, executive orders, administrative orders, rules, regulations, statutes, or ordinances regarding firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition that are not mirrored in state law. A good step forward. It had a lot of pushback from some establishment types. It finally got passed out of committee by a vote of 7-5 in November. We were told a number of times that this was coming to the floor, since I think the Speaker of the House is in support, but there's some other people who have some power, and the establishment red team people have some power. It was supposed to come for a vote. It was supposed to go to a vote last week, Wednesday, and then they did a parliamentary move at the last second, said, nope, we're not going to do it. And then so it was supposed to come to a vote again today. I think this might be the last day of the session for the year where they're able to do floor action without some type of emergency parliamentary move. And yesterday, they pulled kind of a parliamentary move where they kicked it back to committee, making it very unlikely that it'll get passed. But I want to point out that it is generally the establishment red team, along with their financial backers in law enforcement lobby groups, that fight most aggressively against this type of legislation. So it's very important to know that. You definitely, if you live in Ohio, you definitely want to let your state representatives know that you support House Bill 51. In case it doesn't get through today and doesn't get through maybe in one more try in the next month, then we want to get another round at this, another crack at it again. Anyway, so that's the Second Amendment Preservation Act in Ohio, and we expect to see a number of other states consider similar legislation in 2024. Just none have been filed as of yet. So
And I keep thinking of the comparison of the Kennedy assassination and even the understanding of 9/11. You know, and time reveals that people will change their minds slowly as the evidence creeps out. And that, of course, is sad because I think that when I see all these tragedies, you know, what do we do now? We're involved in a tragic event going on in Ukraine. We're involved with weaponizing the people who are doing a lot of killing, you know, in Palestine.
Yeah.
So it's that incident that get us involved. that makes me upset because we shouldn't be doing it, and we're broke. We shouldn't be doing it under the law, the Constitution. We shouldn't be doing it because we don't have the money, and we shouldn't be doing it because it's very, very dangerous to us. And yet they do it, and then they say, oh, what are we going to do? There's a crisis, like in this example. This is the crisis of the First Amendment on what's going on. And of course, it all has important discussion, but it's sort of after the fact, when it was just the prevention. When I think of what the founders did, they were trying to prevent this, and there were a lot of thou shalt nots in the Constitution, but they forgot it in that, and this is why we're in this mess. But I think we're facing, and we're seeing a reflection of moral bankruptcy and financial bankruptcy and coming together, and people are scared, and they don't quite understand it, and that's the most important thing that we can do, is to help them to understand why this has happened, rather than saying, send me more government, because that will not solve the problem.
Who knows? Part of me cynically wonders if the deep state is not taking a move and saying, we got to get Joe out. His numbers are in the tank. The guy is definitely not operating on all cylinders. There's no question about that. We got to get this guy out. We've been saying this for a while, so we could be wrong. But I just kind of wonder if the deep state's not making a move on it.
Isn't it interesting? They impeached Trump twice, but they never had a proper vote, to authorize it by the Congress, which would have been a pretty good idea. And I think that's the law. But this time the Republicans seem to be wanting to follow those rules, and they're serious about it. But we'll have to see, because there will be a lot of obstacles. It's pretty hard for Trump to win many legal cases, with the saturation of the Justice Department and the FBI and the rest of them who tend to gang up on anybody that think they should have fairness delivered to Trump.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Here's a couple of tweets that just to show. If you do the next one, this is what RNC Research, obviously a biased source, but they're often clever and funny. Put this up. Hunter Biden moves the goalposts again. My father was not financially involved in my business. That's going to be a hard sell. I mean, there's a lot of evidence out there. Maybe it's right. It's hard to believe that a guy like Hunter could just emerge out of nowhere. If he were born to a humble family in Iowa or something, could have emerged to be this amazing businessman, particularly with his private activities seemingly compromising his business sense. And then just to give credit to Zero Hedge, we stole their headline, so we got to give them some credit, because it's pretty funny, and they're often very funny and sarcastic. We'll put that next one up, if you don't mind that next clip. Here he goes. I did not have financial relations with that father. It's 30, almost 30 years now since Clinton uttered that, and it's now kind of entered the lexicon. So we'll see what's happening. But speaking of Biden, Dr. Paul, we'll move on to our second story. Biden is finding himself in a serious bind on the Gaza stuff. I'm going to put on this next clip. This is Dave DeCamp. Great article, as usual, great summary of what's going on. I had a chat with our friend Eric Garris this morning, and he said, have a look at this. I'd already read it. Biden says Israel's Gaza bombing campaign is indiscriminate, but he vows to keep supporting it. So this is the bind he's in. He's now been forced, and I have some poll numbers later. You know how much I love those, Dr. Paul. He's been forced now to say, you guys, you're killing so many civilians. Can you please knock it off? By the way, here's some more money. Here's some more missiles to do it.
Well, it can get a little depressing. You pointed out to me this article about Mersheimer.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have read it, even
Sorry
though I knew
about that,
because it's so depressing.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like, is this true? And I know it's true. Mersheimer isn't going to write garbage.
No, he's a very serious guy.
And he even starts his article by saying, he doesn't expect to change the world, but he wanted to be recorded.
Yeah.
And I understand exactly the feeling. So, but it was so depressing, and because it really challenges what's going on in here. How can you criticize Israel at the time they're special? And that's more or less what Biden said. They criticize the bombing, but we have to keep supporting it. So it's on and on. It's sort of a religious dedication. In many ways, there is a religious dedication, and you can't challenge it. But that is so difficult. But the violence there, it's just so sickening. And when does it come outrageous and everybody say it must stop? Essentially, when the original Holocaust, or the one everybody talks about, most people didn't say, oh, there was a division. There was
pros and cons. Yeah.
But now there is a division on this, even though you're expected. Sometimes you wonder how can they have this sustaining ability to go through the violence over there. I mean, This is just pretty horrible. Whole concern is, why can't we live in peace? And of course, it's where the power and the authority and the propagandists are. They say, well, we have a majority vote here, and a majority says you have to do ABC regardless. And they don't have a basic moral principle like maybe they ought to say, what is this non-interventionist stuff?
Yeah.
You mean the government just should stay out of our lives, and they should stay out of regulating the economy? They should stay out of regulating the interest rates? And should we stay out of the internal affairs of other nations? They don't go to that point, but someday they better, because we won't. One article we quoted there showed that we're involved in all these wars. We finance it. If we quit doing it, the war is going to stop. Wow. It's probably no more difficult than that.
What then was Plato's error? Well, said Aristotle, Plato confuses abstraction with entities, with things. We can separate the common characteristics running through a group of particulars from the differences among them. We can do that as a mental process, as a process of thought. We can form an idea of what is in common among a group of particulars, ignoring the differences. But this does not mean, says Aristotle, that this common denominator can exist in reality apart from its particular accompaniments. It is simply an abstraction, a result of selective awareness on our parts. For instance, we can look at a whole bunch of colored surfaces of all different shapes, but let us say all of the shade of red. And we can say focus on the red and ignore the varying shapes. We can make a mental abstraction and arrive at the idea of red regardless of shape. But that doesn't mean that there can be a dimension in which color floats free without any shape whatever. And the same is true of all abstraction. Plato thinks that because we can separate two different elements in thought, therefore they can exist separately in reality, one in one reality and one in another. This is, says Aristotle, the fallacy of reification, R-E-I-F-I-C-A-T-I-O-N, which means literally thing-making. He makes a thing out of what is simply an abstraction. Therefore, as far as the argument that we called Plato's argument number one in favor of the world of forms, you remember the argument from the differences between universals and particulars. And Plato said they have all these differences, so they must be two worlds. Aristotle says you're simply committing the fallacy of reification. It's true, for instance, that the universal is one and the particulars are many. But that is because we are focusing on the one identity running through the class, which is the same for each example. But that doesn't mean we're thinking of a single super entity, merely of the identical element in all the otherwise differing particulars. And the same for the issue that universals are unchanging and particulars are changing. True, says Aristotle, but that merely means we are abstracting mentally away from all the changes in the particulars. We are focusing our attention mentally on the permanent, enduring element, which gives them a certain character, ignoring in our thought all of the changing accompaniments. So that, for instance, particular men change, but we can concentrate in thought on the element of them which doesn't change, the element they have in common, by a process of abstraction. And therefore, it's true we can think separately one unchanging element, ignoring the many differences. That does not mean it exists by itself in another dimension. The conclusion is only particular, individual, concrete things exist in reality. They are the units of reality. What then is Aristotle's own position on universals? Well, he holds universals are, in a way, distinguishable from particulars. To that extent, Plato is right. And universals are real. They are the basis of conceptual thought. They are the objects of conceptual thought. To that extent, Plato is right. But only particulars exist. That's Aristotle's essential principle. How then will we interpret universals? Well, Aristotle's famous answer is universals do exist. They are real, but they exist only in particulars. There are, he says, two elements in each thing which exists. Each thing which exists is a metaphysical compound comprised of two elements. On the one hand, everything is an individual, particular, concrete. It is what Aristotle calls a this. It has something unique about it. But it also has a certain nature. And there are certain characteristics which it shares with other things on the basis of which we can classify it. It is not only a this, it is a such, a certain kind of thing. So everything is a this, such, a particular of a certain kind, an individual which belongs to a certain class. So to take simply one example, if I point to the gentleman in the front row, you are in one respect an absolutely unique, unrepeatable individual. Even if by a fantastic science fiction method we would create another individual who was identical to you in all physical and psychological characteristics, so there was no way qualitatively of distinguishing you, you would still be you and not him, and he would still be him and not you. Individuality is an irreducible element. There's something unique about you. What it is, I'll tell you next week. I'll give you part of the answer this week, but the full answer next week. But in any event, there is something unique about you. On the other hand, obviously, you have many characteristics in common with other entities on the basis of which we call you human, living, etc.
So on Wednesday, the Senate passed the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, and this is the bill that funds the Pentagon. It also includes some funds for other government agencies' military spending, such as the Energy Department's nuclear weapons program, but the bulk of it, the majority of it, goes to the Pentagon. And the bill passed in a vote of 87-13, so it got lots of support. 6 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent, which is Bernie Sanders, voted against it. And now the NDAA heads to the House, where it is expected to pass in a vote on Thursday. So this NDAA, the way it works, the House creates their version of the bill, the Senate creates their version, and then the 2 chambers negotiate. So this is the finalized version. So it's expected to go through the House, and then it goes to President Biden's desk to be signed into law. And this is a process I usually follow pretty closely this time of year. In the fall into the winter is when these negotiations are usually going on. But with everything that's been happening with Gaza, I mean, I've barely paid attention, been able to really follow it. So I'm not sure of all the horrible things that are in here. I'm going to try to find out, what kind of new things there are. All this stuff is really bad that's packed into this bill, but they always try to add new things. So one thing that's in this that is really bad is that it will extend Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and that gives the FBI the power to conduct warrantless spying of Americans and foreigners. It's designed to give them the power to conduct surveillance of foreigners, but it applies to any Americans that they might be talking to, that interacting with. And this has been abused, so horribly. It gives them just so much power to spy on us. And it was due to expire at the end of this year, but this NDAA pushes it back to April 19th. So it's a temporary extension until they can either extend it even more or find some other new form of this. But they don't want to give this spying power up. Now, there was a bipartisan group of senators that tried to stop this and tried to strip the Section 702 extension from the NDAA, but their efforts failed. So they actually only needed 41 senators to remove this provision. It's for procedural reasons. I couldn't really figure out why that's all they needed. But anyway, they needed 41 senators, but they only got 35. Houthi officials said on Wednesday that the only way to restore calm in the Red Sea is through a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. And this comes amid reports of another Houthi attack in the waters. So Yemen's Houthi movement, formerly known as Ansar Allah, has been targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea that they claim are Israeli-linked or bound for Israel, and they've been doing this in response to what Israel's doing in Gaza. They have also fired missiles and drones at Israeli territory. So this is Abdul Malik al-Ajri. He's a member of Ansar Allah's political bureau. He said, quote, "There is no way of preventing the escalation except by moving towards a permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip," end quote. The U.S. has been considering forming an international naval coalition to patrol the waters off Yemen's coast, but al-Ajri said even if all the fleets in the world gathered in the Red Sea, it would, quote, "not bring security to Israel or Israeli ships, not to any ships headed to Israel," end quote. So also on Wednesday, a U.S. military official told Reuters that the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Mason shot down a Houthi drone that was headed in its direction as it was responding to an attack on a commercial vessel, the tanker Ardmore Encounter. The official said the Houthis attacked the tanker with skiffs and fired 2 missiles that missed. So, as I covered yesterday, the Biden administration is threatening to kill a peace plan between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis in response to the attacks in the Red Sea. The U.S. is considering redesignating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, which would make the first phase of a Saudi-Houthi peace deal that's been reached that I wasn't aware of before yesterday, that they actually have agreed on a peace deal that could be implemented. But if the U.S. does that designation, it would make the first phase impossible. So, the U.S. is considering very extreme measures here. Donald Tusk, he is Poland's new pro-EU prime minister. He was sworn in on Wednesday and delivered a speech the day before where he vowed that his government would push for the West to continue supporting Ukraine in its war with Russia. So Tusk, who previously served as prime minister from 2007 to 2014, promised Poland's, quote, "full involvement with Ukraine in this cruel conflict with the Russian aggressor," end quote. He also said that he was fed up with European politicians and other countries from the West, politicians who said they were getting tired of the situation in Ukraine. He said it is the task of the Polish government to, quote, "loudly and firmly demand the full determination from the entire Western community to help Ukraine in this war. I will do this from day one," end quote. So Poland has been a very staunch supporter of the proxy war since the Russian invasion. But if you remember a few months ago, Tusk's predecessor, Mateusz Morawiecki, said that Warsaw was done arming Ukraine. They had this big spat over Ukrainian grain. There was a glut of Ukrainian grain coming into Poland, and Poland banned the import, or maybe they let it travel through to other parts of Europe, but they didn't want to sell it on their market because Polish farmers weren't happy. And Zelensky got all upset about it, and they had kind of this public spat. And then he said, yeah, we're not giving you weapons anymore. And it was kind of seen as a pre-election move to appeal to his base. But it was still significant because it showed a kind of a big fracture in NATO support for Ukraine. Because, again, Poland was a big supporter of all this. But now Tusk is in, and Poland's back, all in on the proxy war.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Disagree with what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. Voltaire said that. And you go on to write, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he included in it a list of the colonists' grievances with the British government. Notably absent were any complaints that the British government infringed upon the freedom of speech.
They didn't infringe upon the freedom of the colonists' speech. That didn't start until we had a federal government here. And the federal government enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a crime to criticize the federal government. And people, including a congressman by the name of Matthew Lyons from Vermont, were prosecuted and convicted under it. The column catalogs a long list of excesses by presidents and Congresses until 1969, when the Supreme Court finally said, forget it. All innocuous speech is absolutely protected, and all speech is innocuous when there is time for more speech to challenge it. The whole purpose of the First Amendment is to keep the government out of the business of speech. So what business does the Congress have subpoenaing college presidents saying, you didn't protect certain groups of your students from harmful speech? You don't deserve to be a college president. The Congress has nothing to say about speech. We're not talking about speech at West Point, which the government owns. That's a different story. We're talking about speech on a private university campus, and Congress is berating college presidents because they were silent in the face of speech that Congress hates. What speech does Congress hate? Well, I'll give you a guess. The House of Representatives voted 416-1 to condemn anti-Semitism without defining what the heck it meant. So if you say on a college campus today, stop the slaughter of Palestinians, the Congress wants you to provide a forum for the slaughter to be defended. And if you don't, they will call you before Congress and berate you. That's the depth to which we have sunk today. That is the rejection of their oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution by 416-1. The one is Congressman Thomas Massey, of course. He's the personification of courage.
You have here, stated differently, each of the signatories of the Declaration and all of the ratifiers of the Bill of Rights manifested in writing the unambiguous understanding that the freedom of speech is a natural right, personal to every human. It does not come from the government. It comes from within us. It cannot be taken away by legislation or executive command or popular will. They were 100% wrong.
It is being taken away by legislation, by executive command, and by popular will, by browbeating people into a sense of conformity, by scaring people away from expressing certain views. This congresswoman from Michigan sang a song, from the ocean to the sea, Palestine will be free, and she was censured by the House of Representatives. Even the British Parliament doesn't censure for making statements that are against the green.
Right here, you said, yet in perilous times like the present, we have seen zealots use Congress, the police, and public opinion to block speech that they hate. And I want to stop right at that because, again, going back to what happened with this, with the college presidents, they were saying that they supported these students that was saying, I don't know the exact words, but, we have to destroy all Israelis or kill the Israelis.
The students chanted the same song that the congresswoman chanted. It's a song. From the ocean to the sea, Palestine will be free. And these members of Congress were berating presidents because they permitted that free speech, because they didn't speak out against it. That's
they also claim that these students said other things.
Yes.
And the fact is that they asked to show a video or anything of them saying that, and they couldn't come up with one of them. This representation of American history, the country that our founding fathers fought for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that have been stolen from us in front of everybody's eyes for all to see. You go on, during the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln locked up thousands of journalists in the North who were critical of his war efforts. During World War I, President Wilson, who my alma mater, president of Princeton University, is trying to erase from its memory, arrested students for reading the Declaration of Independence aloud or singing German beer hall songs. Now, I'm mentioning this, again, you got to read what the judge is writing here, but what's important about this, 2 wars, Abraham Lincoln's murderous war that killed what, some 700,000 people, destroyed the South?
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson's murderous war that dragged the United States into it. We're fighting for democracy. I'm a Yankee Doodle dandy. They do this at wartime, just like they're silencing us now as wars are raging.
The silencing of us now is a prelude to war, because as you have said countless times, better than anybody else, Gerald, when all else fails, they take you to war.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2429 of The Tom Woods Show. All right, y'all. Welcome to the Scott Horton Show. It's episode 5973 of the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Institute, what just published your brand new book, Diary of a Psychosis, How Public Health Disgraced Itself During COVID Mania. This one was very personal to me. It was a good friend of mine, a writer for us at antiwar.com, Reese Ehrlich, who is a leftist, and a longtime activist and a great journalist. I mean, he would go to war zones like Patrick Coburn and those guys and wrote a great book about the war in Syria. And he was a great regular guest on my show and a great, I don't know, friend, but a close and nice acquaintance of mine. And they killed him with this stuff. Yeah, I mean, his story, if it wasn't previously unpublished, it would belong right in collateral damage there. And it was his last article for antiwar.com was how I think he'd been forced for whatever bureaucratic reason to switch from Blue Cross to Kaiser Permanente out there in California. And then they just refused to see him, even though he knew he had colon cancer. And they just told him, nah, it's a slow-growing cancer. You'll be fine. And they put him off and put him off and put him off. And he finally was able to go to the doctor, I think, in January of 21 or maybe December of 20. And they said, oh, yeah, no, sorry, you're stage 4, pal. You're done. It's in your liver, in your brain, in your everything, whatever it was. And so he wrote his last article for antiwar.com. He was like, well, sayonara, pal. I guess I'm a dead man. And he died? Yeah, he died right after that, Tom. Like in February or something. He lasted another couple of weeks after that. And he just said, like, well, I know I'm dead, so if anybody wants to write me a nice email about a nice time we ever had somewhere or whatever, geez, I always thought I'd grow old and write my memoirs and have a nice life and look at my grandchildren and grow up. And anyway, bye. And then that was it. He was dead. And imagine, I mean, in California, in the land was supposed to be the most wealthy and advanced state in the most wealthy and advanced country in the world. They refused to treat this guy who he wasn't destitute, living in a gutter, and somehow the social safety net missed him or whatever. He had a job, Tom. He had health insurance, and he couldn't get treatment. They refused to see him because they knew he was dying of cancer, but they refused to treat him because the healthcare workers, supposedly, or their bosses, were afraid that they would get a respiratory virus. And what in the world is that? Who's making those calculations to decide that at my friend Reese's expense? You wrote all these essays. It's 3 years worth of emails that you sent out about all of this stuff, railing against this stuff. But at some point you decided to do what I know that you had already decided you did not want to do anymore, which is make a book out of it and publish it. So what was it that you tell us? Was there a story there, or was it just you decided for a specific reason that you wanted to do it this way? So I don't want to write a book that's just like a chapter on masks and a chapter on lockdowns. I want to walk people through, if not day by day, at least in chronological order, as the madness unfolded and what we were all thinking and what was happening and what the numbers were showing, what the graphs all said. And you're right, Scott, about this format makes it possible to look back and say, oh, well, somebody actually knew by X month of X year what was really happening. So in flipping through the book just now, I just discovered that there's a guy named David Leonhardt who writes for the New York Times. And maybe about a year and a half ago, I guess 2 years ago, he started writing a column consistently in his own newsletter that you would get through the New York Times about COVID. And it was his job to gradually and slowly break it to the readers of the New York Times that none of this crazy nonsense they'd been doing had really accomplished anything. But he didn't start saying that until October 2021. October 2021. The damage is all done. The developing world is decimated by this. In Myanmar, they're reporting that people were eating rats and snakes because when they have no incomes, this is how they have to eat to feed their families. Takes them till October 2021 to bother to look at the charts and say, you know what? Doesn't seem like it made any difference. Well, I kind of figured it out early on, and not because I have great insight, just because I like listening to dissident voices. And they're not always right, but sometimes they are. And obviously there was a tremendous groupthink and herd mentality going on in early 2020. So I actively sought out people who weren't part of that. And I want to know, why do you have a different point of view? What are you basing it on? And then I would just look at the charts, and the charts told all the stories.
They sure did. I mean, it was, I think, the first or second time I was on Kennedy's show on Fox News. I said, go look at Tom's charts. None of this made the difference, the covidcharts.com or whatever the site there.
Oh, yeah, covidchartsquiz.com. Yeah, that was, I'm happy about that whole thing too. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's definitely something to brag about. I mean, the whole thing when I'm reading it reminded me of the weapons of mass destruction, right? It's like reading Raimondo about the WMDs. Like, I'll never forget, because there's like a scene in my living room that coincided with it when the antiwar.com ran the headline from the Washington Post in September 2002 that those aluminum tubes, those are for rockets. You could never use those for a centrifuge, man. Don't give me a break. So says every actual expert on Earth, and including the horrible David Albright, who was probably an Israeli spy anyway. And even he debunked it. And then, Tom, they kept talking about the aluminum tubes like they hadn't already been debunked in the Post for months and months and months. They kept saying aluminum tubes. Why we got to invade Iraq? Tom, get this. Aluminum tubes. That's why I got to invade Iraq. And that's what it's like reading your book. It's like, wait a minute, man. You can't be sitting here in December and then in March and then in August again telling me what Tom already debunked last July. It ain't right. You can't keep using the aluminum tubes after they've been debunked, man. And they just keep doing it. And it's frustrating in a way to go back and see just how thoroughly you knew better and when. Not you guessed better, and not your libertarian principle would never give in to their policy anyway, but knew better, demonstratively knew better by X date. I don't want to root for it. I'm already saying too much, but you knew so soon. And then the whole rest of the book takes place after that.
Yeah.
And I'm just sitting here hitting myself in the head the whole time going, I can't believe this.
The Peter Schiff Show. Now, the way the mainstream media is framing this is that the Fed won. This is the victory dance. The Fed has won the inflation fight, and that's why it doesn't have to hike rates anymore. Rate hikes are over, and we can now look forward to rate cuts that are going to be starting next year, maybe early next year. And of course, the market is celebrating. The Dow is up better than 500 points today. In fact, it set a new all-time record high. The Dow closed above 37,000 for the first time ever. And the intraday high, I'm reading it, was 37,094.85. Now, even though the Dow hit a record, it wasn't the biggest gainer on the day. The Russell 2000 was up like 3.5%. Although that's the only index that didn't hit a 52-week high. The S&P 500 and the NASDAQ hit new highs for the year, although only the Dow set a record high. Although I do want to put that record in its proper context, because the mainstream media will never do that. So if you take the price of gold of approximately $2,000 an ounce, although right now it is trading above that by a comfortable margin. Let me check on the current price of gold. It's at $22,040 almost, so $40 above 2,000. But if you just figure about 2,000, just to make the math easy, at 37,000, the Dow is roughly 18.5 ounces of gold. So that's the price of the Dow if you buy it with gold. Well, that's not a record high, not even close. In fact, in 1966, the Dow was about 20 ounces of gold. So from the 1966 peak to today, in terms of real money, the Dow is actually lower than it was in 1966. In fact, it's maybe lower than it was in 1929 in terms of gold. But if you want to know where the record high was, it was 1999, not that long ago. In 1999, the Dow cost 42 ounces of gold, almost. That's the all-time record. The Dow has never been more expensive, priced in real money, than it was in 1999. Now, that's how big that bubble was during that decade. But we're still down 55+% from that record. So the price of the Dow in gold would have to double from here in order to get that record, to reclaim that record. So it's not going to happen. But the reason you want to think about the price of the Dow in terms of gold is because gold has real value. You can't measure it in terms of the dollar. the dollar's lost 99% of its value relative to gold since the beginning of the Federal Reserve. So obviously, the price of everything is going to go up when you're measuring it with something that's gone down by 99%. So you take that out of it and you look at the real value, and it's not a record. But historically, the Dow is expensive. 18.5 ounces of gold is a high price. The Dow does not deserve a high price. I think the Dow should actually have a low price. There are so many problems looming on the horizon for the U.S. stock market that it should be trading at a discount to its historic average, not at a premium. I think we have a long way to go on the downside for the real value of the Dow. Now, I don't know, nominally, the Dow could keep rising. And in fact, after today, I expect the U.S. stock market to keep rising. Not for the right reasons, but for the wrong reasons. But it looks like the Dow's going to go up. I don't recommend buying it because I think foreign stocks will beat the Dow. I think emerging markets will beat the Dow. I think gold stocks will beat it. So I think that there are better horses to be on. And I do think, though, that the Dow is going to do better than the NASDAQ. I think that this new rally is going to be led by value stocks, even in the U.S. Real businesses are going to be the drivers this time, not the pie-in-the-sky, hyped-up companies. That's one of the reasons that the Dow outperformed the NASDAQ today. So I think that shift is taking place. But there's a much broader shift that most investors haven't even noticed, and that's the shift to international stocks, to international value, emerging markets, commodities, natural resources, gold. These are the trends that I think are going to dominate going forward. They are going to cut, and they don't give a damn about inflation. If they really wanted to make sure inflation was gone and dead and buried, they would wait for 2%. In fact, they would want to let it go below 2% for a while just to make sure it stayed there. Like, what if you just touch 2% and then immediately go right back up? I mean, what good is it, right? This is all a bunch of BS. Reporter asked him, that same reporter said, well, what about 3% then? I mean, if we're below 3%, is that good to go? Is that when you can start cutting rates? And Powell said, well, I don't want to put a number on it. I don't want to have any specific level, which probably means it doesn't even have to be under 3%. It could be over 3%, and they're going to keep cutting because the cuts have got nothing to do with inflation. They're not cutting because they won the inflation war. Again, they're cutting because the economy can't afford to win the inflation war. So inflation have won, and we're cutting to bail everybody else out.
Anyway, there was a vote yesterday on NDAA. I recall it very much in the presidential campaigns because I was fascinated that when I went to college campuses, they seemed to be a step ahead of me. They seemed to know and was excited about it a little bit before I was, but they got my attention.
Yeah.
And we spent a lot of time on that. Then we dealt with the legislation and how evil it has. And here, all we've been trying to do is rein in some of the bad things on the Patriot Act, along with how they get things extended. So this was an extension, but it's bad enough that they just go ahead and do it anyway and spy on us. Nobody should assume that the federal government doesn't spy on anybody they want, and they did that before they had Section 702. But there should be at least an image of the Congress and the people saying, no, this is not right. You shouldn't be doing this. That is not intended in the Constitution. But nevertheless, it passed the Senate yesterday, and we were thinking before our program started, well, maybe we could talk about it and tell them, get involved here, call your congressman, make sure your vote's right on this. But the vote has already occurred, and it was not a victory for the Fourth Amendment. It was, the bill was passed, which means not only the 702, that's passed all that money also.
Yeah.
And the money, it says it's 886 billion. You could round it off to $1 trillion.
Yeah.
You say, well, that's stretching it. No, it's minimizing it because you have to figure there will be there'll be another bill soon, and they'll eventually get money for Ukraine. It'll go on and on, but there's always going to be an emergency. And right now they have a lot of choices. They want that $111 billion they want is for Ukraine, Israel, and also Taiwan.
Yeah,
and so there'll be an American ship sunk or something, and then if anybody opposes them, it would be equivalent to the unity that 9/11 brought on. But anyway, the NDAA passed, and that means some effort made it, and they did try to curtail that, and they had one vote there to try to strip it, and because they had to have 2/3 vote, they almost were able to strip the 702 from there, but that didn't happen, and it's a shame, but I think people become numb to this. They might hear about it and say, that's terrible, terrible. And then, what am I going to do about it? Well, some days we feel that way too, but what we can do, the best thing we can do is try to call attention to people and to say that this is not going to stop until the people say enough is enough. And that's how things get changed. And in certain things in recent years, there have been a few things where the people just say enough is enough and we don't want you, hounding us to death. Certainly the COVID lockdown issues, that shifted when the people woke up.
Yeah, as you say, if they just dealt with this bill, there would be a debate, and it might not pass because Americans might say, we don't want this anymore. And that's why they sneak it in.
Yeah.
Well, here's Ed Snowden did a tweet this morning after it passed, and he's obviously disgusted, if we can put it up. He's obviously disgusted with what happened. And here's what he said. Congress has voted to pass the NDAA, in which they deceitfully concealed an extension of the warrantless spying program, Section 702, universally opposed by the public. Good point. You listen to this part. Last year, the FBI exploited 702 to spy on Americans, and that's protesters, donors, even Congress, more than 200,000 times. So,
if we're not careful, they might even start spying for political reasons and checking in on these other candidates and getting illegal warrants to spy. That's really when it gets bad, because that's when they get the Department of Justice on their side and the courts.
That clip, by the way, they're back at it again. The same group. It's not every one of them, but that group, as you say, they overthrew the election. It wasn't the Russians who interfered. It was all these former intelligence officers. They signed a letter saying, well, in our vast experience with intelligence, we can say that the Hunter Biden laptop is classic Russian disinformation. They just flat out lied, Dr. Paul, and everyone knows it. As you say, it affected the elections. Well, normal people who are not nihilists, as you write a lot about, who are not sociopaths, they would probably shrink away and just not go public again. They would feel some disgrace. Not these guys. They're back, and they signed a new letter saying, keep spying on Americans. It's good for us.
That's how we maintain our power and our cash flow.
Yeah.
So the military people seem to do well. If you can become a general and then you retire, you've taken the course to become that type of a lobbyist. But then you have the media that are participating in it. But we see that all the time too. The media participate in it. They had to participate in the lockdown. I mean, look at all the scare tactics that were put up by the government.
Yeah.
But if independent sources, if physicians or anybody did and tried to give a different spin on this, they'd lose their job.
Yeah.
They wouldn't lose their reputation. With the good people, their reputation goes way up.
Yeah.
But they lose their jobs, and some of them are still recovering from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's two elements. What is sometimes called the universalizing element and the particularizing or individuating element. Now, Aristotle has his own terminology for these two elements. For the universal element, he uses the word form, borrowing from Plato. For the particular individuating element, he uses the term matter. That simply means the thisness, the uniqueness of any particular. Now, this is a very specialized Aristotelian usage of the word matter. It does not mean matter as we use the term today. I'll discuss it more fully later this evening. For now, I just want to introduce the term. You think of it in this preliminary stage as matter stands for those aspects of a thing which make it unique. Form, those aspects of a thing it shares with other things. Now, in these terms, we can, says Aristotle, formulate a philosophic law. You never can have matter without form, nor form without matter. Plato and Heraclitus, each from their own perspectives, violated this law. Plato's got form without matter all over the place in his world of universals without particulars. Manness apart from individual men, etc. Heraclitus made the opposite mistake. He's got matter, but without form. There's some kind of stuff in Heraclitus' world, but it has no nature, no identity. It isn't anything. It isn't, and it's constantly swimming, you see. And therefore, he's got matter without form, particulars of no nature. Now, Aristotle's principle is no matter without form, no form without matter. If something exists, it's something. In other words, it has form. And if it exists as a real, particular, a concrete, here and now matter. So much for Aristotle's attack on Plato's world of forms. Now, Aristotle's own position on universals is philosophically given the technical name Aristotelian realism. The idea being realism here means he believes universals are real. Aristotelian realism because he takes Aristotle's interpretation, namely that they exist only in particulars. Plato's view, of course, is called Platonic realism in the theory of universals for obvious reasons. Now I have a further preliminary metaphysical point to make. What does Aristotle have to say to the earlier pre-Socratics who had said, for instance, that this world exists, but it is only actions, process, change, not entities, a la Heraclitus? Or that, turning to the Pythagoreans, reality exists, but it really is numbers or quantities. Aristotle, in a famous work called The Categories, in which he classifies the basic types of existence, he kind of gives you an inventory of the most fundamental categories of reality. In that work, he takes formally the view that the fundamental constituent of reality is the entity, the thing, the individual thing. Actions, he insists, are actions of entities, actions of things. You can't have a room filled with running unless there's something running. You can't have a room filled with digesting unless there's something doing the digesting, etc. Change, action, motion are simply names for what entities do. Wipe out the entities, you wipe out the action. And the same principle applies to quantities. You can't have a room filled with 6 or 20,000 because the question is 6 or 20,000 what, you see. And quantities, in other words, are quantities of entities. The fundamental constituents of the world are entities, which Aristotle calls, his technical term is primary beings or primary substances. That means simply entity if you encounter that phrase in Aristotle. Now there are, he says, many derivative types of existence which are not entities, such as actions or quantities or qualities, for instance, red, loud, beautiful, or relationships, for instance, above or below or similar to or uncle of, etc. And he mentions several other such categories. But his main point is these are all derivative forms of existence. None of these categories can exist apart from entities. If there's no entities, there's no actions, because what would be performing? No qualities, because what would be possessing? No quantities, same question. No relations, because between or among what would those relations inhere? So to summarize that point, the world consists of primary substances, individual entities, each a particular with a certain nature, engaged in various actions, possessing various qualities, bearing certain relationships to each other. In other words, reality is the world of common sense. It is the everyday world we live in. It and you are not a reflection, or a flux, or a contradiction, or a dream, or a nothing, or a string of essences polluted by empty space. Reality is this world as it appears to human senses. This is the world we want to know and understand.
So Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has decided to keep senators in town next week to continue negotiations on a border deal that will unlock a massive $111 billion spending package that includes military aid for everybody. There's aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan in this huge spending package that they want to pass. And the Senate's holiday recess was set to start on Friday, but Schumer is delaying that as he says negotiations are moving along. Schumer said, quote, "The Senate will return Monday. That will give negotiators from the White House, Senate Democrats, and Senate Republicans a time to work through the weekend in an effort to reach a framework agreement," end quote. So House Speaker Mike Johnson has already adjourned the House. So the House is not sticking around. They're going on their holiday recess, which is very long. I mean, December 15th through after the New Year, that's a long time off. But anyway, so that means even if the Senate does reach a deal, they're not going to be able to finalize this bill and pass it and make it law until after the new year. Johnson said the House will not wait around to receive and debate a rushed product. So Schumer vowed that there will still be a vote on the military aid package next week. He said, quote, "No matter what, members should be aware that we will vote on a supplemental proposal next week," end quote. So Republicans are looking for significant changes to immigration laws to make it harder for migrants to enter the country. And there are signs that President Biden is willing to give them what they want to secure the over $60 billion that he wants to fund the proxy war in Ukraine for another year. CBS reported that the White House indicated to Congress that it would support new immigration restrictions, including giving border officials the authority to expel migrants without processing their asylum claims, and a dramatic expansion of deportations and detentions. House passes the $886 billion National Defense Authorization Act. So the Senate passed this bill on Wednesday night, and now the House passed it on Thursday. And this is the NDAA. This is what funds the Pentagon, and it also funds some military spending in other government agencies. And it's worth $886 billion. So now it heads to President Biden's desk. He's probably going to sign it on Friday sometime. And this includes a provision to extend Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA. This is a really bad thing that gives the U.S. government power to conduct mass warrantless surveillance against Americans. The way that they justify it is they say that the law is designed to target foreigners that aren't in the United States, But the way it's written is that it allows them to collect surveillance of any Americans that they interact with. And that includes, wiretapping and collecting text, emails, and things like that. And it just has been abused and abused. But they are voting to extend it. So it was due to expire at the end of this year, and this extends it to April 19th of next year. According to Thomas Massey, House representative from Kentucky, he said that the House only needed 143 votes to strip the extension out of the NDAA, but only 118 House members voted nay, including 73 Republicans and 45 Democrats. So they couldn't get 143 members of the House to vote against this. And when it comes to just the size of the NDAA, again, it's $886 billion. That's $28 billion more than last year. This is something that increases every year. And Biden's looking for the over $100 billion for all that military aid on top of this. So packed into the NDAA that's been approved by both the House and the Senate is an amendment designed to prevent any future president from withdrawing the U.S. from NATO. The legislation was a bipartisan effort led by Senators Marco Rubio and Tim Kaine, and it would prohibit the president from leaving NATO without Senate approval or an act of Congress. So Kaine said the legislation, quote, reaffirms U.S. support for this crucial alliance that is foundational for our national security. It also sends a strong message to authoritarians around the world that the free world remains united, end quote. So Kaine, Rubio, and other hawks in Congress obviously do not have to worry about President Biden trying to leave NATO, as he is such a staunch supporter of this alliance and everything that they're doing in Ukraine. I've heard Biden call the U.S. obligation to NATO sacred, multiple times. The legislation, this was likely designed with Trump in mind. Now, Trump never said he would pull out of NATO. That's not something he's saying now as he's running again. But he has been critical of the alliance. Specifically, his big thing was he wanted other members to spend more on their military, like Germany. He wanted less of the burden to be on the U.S. when so much of it is on the U.S. But when Trump was president, NATO expanded into two countries. Montenegro in 2017 joined NATO, and North Macedonia in 2020. So this idea that Trump, would just pull out of NATO is just not true. But, this sets the groundwork for if any future president, gets elected on a real non-interventionist platform, that the Congress would handcuff them when it comes to exiting this entangling alliance. When Washington talked about entangling alliances, it doesn't really get more entangling than NATO. Now there's 31 members with Finland joining, soon to be 32, and the U.S. is handing out war guarantees to all these countries.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
So why the market's going up? Well, the markets are going up because now the bet on the Fed street is that the Fed is going to pause interest rates and then lower them at least 75 basis points next year. And we got that 100% right, said it when no one else was saying it. They're going to do it to keep Ms. Faccia Bruta over here that you just saw, Janet Yellen, as the Treasury Secretary. They always lower interest rates in the run-up to the presidential reality show. And that's all this fucking shit show is. It's a fucking two-bit reality show. And by the way, we own that trademark. Yep. Democrats, Crips and Bloods, the crime syndicate, murderers and thieves. Don't forget to vote. Don't forget to vote. So anyway, going back to the markets, that's what's pushing them up. More cheap money going to flow into it. Now, what's also happening, we said, when this happens, gold is going to go up. Now gold's like trading now as we're talking about $2,040 an ounce. And each week in the Trends Journal, this is our 65th week of doing it, we have all the firings going on, people getting laid off. 65 weeks been doing this. Ready? This came out yesterday from the Messenger. More than a third of companies are expecting layoffs next year. Almost 40% of companies are forecasting layoffs in the coming year, and even more are anticipating a hiring freeze, according to a survey of 906 business leaders by Resume Builder. In the first 11 months of the year, companies have cut 686,860 jobs. You ready? 115% increase announced during the same time as last year. This is according to Challenger Gray and Christmas. This was the highest January-November job loss total since 2020. Oh, 2020? When the little fucking scumbags locked down everything? Those little arrogant boys and girls locked down everything? We're fighting the COVID war. We're fighting the COVID war. We'll tell you what to do. And the media whores sold it. Those how bad the fucking numbers are, and the economy's going up. So, speaking of bullshit, crap, and scumbags, more than 2/3 of the U.S. House of Representatives voted in favor of a defense policy bill today that includes a record $886 billion in annual military spending and authorizes policies such as aid for Ukraine, push back against China in the Indo-Pacific. Hey, don't you all care about pushing China back in the Indo-Pacific and Ukraine? The fucking country's going down the crapper, and these little fucking crap heads are stealing our fucking money to give to the military-industrial complex. Yeah, the guy Lloyd Austin, the defense contractor, yeah, Secretary of Defense, last job with Raytheon, the second largest defense contractor in the United States. This is the shit that's going on as our country is going down the crapper because we got crap heads in charge. Look at this stupid shit! Stealing our money as the country's rotting in front of us. Ah, there's a guy. My daddy was an ambassador. My uncle was an ambassador. I'm a member of the club. I love every fucking war since I've been sicking off the public tit since 1994. I'm Anthony Blinken. Go fucking fight. Go to the front lines and fight, all you scumbags that stole our money to give to the military-industrial complex. Calm down, Celente. Biden says Israel's Gaza bombing campaign is indiscriminate, but he vows to keep supporting it. Israel's security can rest on the United States. Isn't that nice? A fucking place that was invented by the United Nations and the Balfour Declaration. But right now it goes on. The literal security of Israel as an independent Jewish state is literally at stake, but it is. We continue to provide military assistance to Israel as it goes after Hamas. Military assistance as it goes after Hamas. They're bombing the fucking place into obliteration. They killed nearly 20,000 people. 70% of them women and children. Destroyed over 100,000 buildings. Stealing our money to do it. Tehran warns of an explosion if war continues. Yep. At least every week we receive a message from the U.S. telling us that the U.S. bases in Syria, Iraq are targeted by some groups, this guy said. These groups are defending the Arab and Muslim people and in Gaza. That is why they're targeting U.S. bases in Syria and Iraq. What the fuck is the United States doing in Syria and Iraq? We have no right being there. He goes on to say, we do not recognize Israel as a government. It has been an occupied power for 75 years. And the European Union has lost credibility on Israel and Palestine, says Ireland's Prime Minister Leo Varadkar. He said that we've lost credibility at the global south, which actually is the most of the world, because of what is perceived to be double standards. And there is some truth in that, quite frankly. Some truth is 100% true. America and its allies can kill and slaughter anybody they want for any fucking reason.
Your daily dose of Liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Thing that prompted me to invite you on here was indeed something relating to Americans for Prosperity. Now, we just found out they made an endorsement in the GOP primary of Nikki Haley. And that made me think maybe I totally misunderstood the nature of this group to begin with. So I don't really know. So can you say something, first of all, before we get into that endorsement, based on your experience in the organization, what is its true nature?
My understanding, the organization that I grew to love when I met them in 2017, they almost purely focused on state level policy and then politics in order to affect that policy, right? Because if you don't have policy champions in the legislature, you can't pass the policies that you're working for. And that was 95% of what they did. And they up till this year, that's what we did. Last year, we endorsed 47 different liberty loving candidates here in New Hampshire. We got most of them over the line. They're in the legislature now doing as much as they can, passing education freedom accounts, lowering taxes, strengthening Second Amendment rights. They're doing all kinds of awesome things. And that was like the bread and butter. That's what I understood the organization to be. So lots of really great people at the state level doing really awesome things. And so all the various state chapters are just out there, like you said, inviting you to do this awesome stuff. They're not holding back, right? They're getting crazy work done at the state level. And then this February, headquarters, our CEO, Emily Seidel, I guess I shouldn't say our anymore, but the CEO, Emily Seidel, announced that they were going to take a path forward to turn the page on the past, is the words that they used, to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't get the nomination again. And so that the country can move forward in all of that. And that was in February. And then, of course, last week you saw Americans for Prosperity Action, AFP Action, endorsed Nikki Haley. So certainly really shocking, right? Because in my view, my personal view, she was so counter to so many of the policies that we've advocated for years. A restrained foreign policy, the opposite, a fair market, a fair and free market, not cronyism and corporatism and subsidies. And, free speech is one of the key pillars of what Americans for Prosperity advocates for. And it was 2 weeks ago, she was rallying to ban anonymous speech online. Yeah. So a lot of those things, it was like, to me, I couldn't make sense of it.
In fact, even when she announced that she was running, I remember thinking, this is completely tone deaf. There is no more any market for a Nikki Haley. What could she be thinking? And then I forgot, the hangers on, the people who expect checks with their names on them in their pockets, in the various sectors like the military industrial complex or whatever. Yeah, I can imagine that those people would support her. But the idea that an Americans for Prosperity would choose her, especially when there's a Ron DeSantis there. And, even if you want to hedge your bets a little bit on foreign policy, okay, well then Ron DeSantis is probably going to be somewhere between Ron Paul and Nikki Haley. So you could always go with him. So why they wouldn't even pick him is astonishing.
Well, in the memo that came out when they announced this, right, it laid out all the numbers. It laid out the polling. Nikki Haley's in second in Iowa. Nikki Haley's in second in New Hampshire. Nikki Haley's in second in South Carolina. Okay. And yeah, let's say that let's just agree that might be the case, right? I'll take them at face value on that. For an organization that espouses principles about politics and people above politics, it didn't make sense to me that just because she has a shot, she would be the one.
Yeah.
And the trade-off being that we're picking somebody less principled that has a better shot. And I personally, I would like to see somebody that's more principled that has a little bit less of a shot. I got into this, full disclosure, in 2016, I didn't have well-formed policy positions. I didn't have a solid foundation. And I kind of, like a lot of voters in this country, kind of swayed with the breeze. I listened to Fox News and CNN, and that's kind of where I got a lot of my opinions from, right? And in 2017, when I went to, it was called Grassroots Leadership Academy, I learned so much from my classmates, from the people that worked there. They really helped me form a foundation of beliefs that I could go back to. So anytime a policy question comes up for me, or a question on what the right thing is, I can go back to that foundation. I can go back to those principles, and I can make a decision based on those. And so as the years went on, 2018, 2019, I was doing activism through AFP. I was, working on other campaigns here in New Hampshire. And I started to really form my core beliefs of what I believed and what is right and what is wrong. And so when I came out and took that bold stance, I've worked jobs that I wasn't passionate about before. And I remember being miserable. And I probably could have stuck my head in the sand, done this for 7 weeks until the New Hampshire primary, gotten through it and gotten back to what we do and what we're passionate about. But right now, just going back to that passion that drives me, the vision of the New Hampshire that I want to see, Nikki Haley doesn't fit into that picture at all. And having her in office doesn't help that mission. It hurts that mission in a lot of ways. And so that's kind of what drove it, right? I had to get back to, I had to be honest with myself and had to be honest with other people about how deeply opposed to this I was.
Before, if this gets clipped and gets in front of other audiences there, it should be pointed out that, as around the last time I had you on the show in 2020, you were like the lone voice who stood up against those insane spending packages that were so largely responsible for the price inflation that followed. And Donald Trump was, let's say, very unfair to you. At the time when he was president, and really sent his people to harass you and stuff for having the nerve to say we should have a vote before we pass the largest spending package in human history. So right. you have a right to be.
I didn't say anything bad about Donald Trump at that time during the CARES Act, but he said, just for merely asking for a recorded vote, he called me a third-rate grandstander and said that I should be kicked out of the GOP. Now, we have since buried the hatchet. Okay, he was against me in that primary, then he was for me in my last primary. And he called me a first-rate defender of the Constitution in my last primary. So we'll see where he ends up in this primary. But the thing about it is, Dave, I don't care what people say. I'm just I'm 10 years into this congressional experiment for myself, running for office and just trying to vote my conscience for the whole 10 years. And it's worked out for me so far. I've had people against me who are no longer here in Congress. Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, Max, donated to my primary opponent. And guess what? I'm here and they're not. So I just don't worry about this stuff too much.
You had proposed an amendment to not enforce car companies for the cars. What's the term I'm looking for here? A kill switch for cars. Explain this to me and my audience, because I do not understand this at all, but it scares me.
Yeah, very quickly. In 2021, as part of that big infrastructure package, the Democrats got inserted into a bill that, frankly, most of them probably didn't read because they were disputing me in the debate on the floor of the House that this provision was even in law, and I had to read the law to them. They got a provision inserted that says by 2026, every auto manufacturer has to have an automated kill switch in the car that basically monitors your driving and determines if you're impaired, not drunk, not under the influence, but impaired. And if you're impaired, it will automatically disable your car. And so in the funding process, when we were still trying to do the 12 bills, by the way, we'd given up on the 12 bills. But when we were still doing the 12 bills, I was able to offer an amendment to defund this kill switch provision. And I thought it would sail through. I actually thought they would let it go on a voice vote. I was having to debate with my staff, should I ask for a recorded vote if they let this pass on a voice vote? And I get there, not only did they not let it pass and they asked for a recorded vote, there were over a dozen Republicans who voted against this amendment. They voted to keep the nanny state in place, to expand the nanny state, over a dozen Republicans. They actually had 2 Democrats vote with me. And okay, I hope it looks like you're sitting down. So I will tell you who one of these 2 Democrats was. It was AOC, voted to defund the kill switch amendment. And what's funny is she asked me about it, and she was concerned about civil liberties. And I said, I have exactly the same concerns. And I told her, here's who will attack you, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So I want you to go into this knowing what you're getting into. Then I said, oh, by the way, their AIPAC's running $90,000 of ads in my district saying that I always vote with you. It's about time you vote with me once on a provision. So that she actually voted to defund the kill switch. I thought that was great.
Well, good for her. She should. We make fun of her when she's wrong about stuff, but she should get credit for the things she's good on. And I will also give her credit for they've the squad types might go say some things that me or you wouldn't agree with about the Israel war, but man, there is some courage it takes right now to kind of stand up against when the war drums start beating. It gets a lot of people to just kind of go along with it because, you don't want to be called all the names that you're going to get called if you oppose it. So I credit everybody up there who is at least trying to be somewhat sane during all of this.
There's a force field around Israel now, and you can't criticize them or else they'll strike it down with a congressional resolution.
Yeah, and it does. It's just it's so reminiscent of kind of the George W. Bush Republican strategy of like, if you criticize the war, then you hate America and you love terrorists or something like that. And it's all so incredibly stupid. But anyway,
you'd love Putin if you don't send another $60 billion to Ukraine.
Now, that's a good transition now. So what's going on with the funding to Ukraine? Because it seems like that's actually coming to an end and not going to pass before Christmas.
If it does pass, I think there's a general feeling here that may be the last tranche of money. Because the question is there enough support to get this passed or not? If there is, there's barely support and it's withering. The statements coming even from Zelensky they're just trying to hold ground. They don't talk about retaking ground. And he really, and we need to help him, needs to start discussing some kind of diplomatic, end to this conflict. And, we've got to be realists on both sides of this. It's almost impossible to find out how many casualties have happened on both sides of this. Now, there are people in the media will be happy to tell you there have been 300,000 Russian casualties. And then you ask them how many Ukrainian casualties, and there were 100 or something. Like, it's just ridiculous. We need to end this war. Zelensky's over here. He's gone to the Senate, where I think they're more supportive in the Senate than they are in the House. So he went there because he might get booed in the House. And then he met with all the military-industrial complex yesterday as well, had his picture with them. So he's here doing the rounds. Since the war in Afghanistan has ended, there's about a $50 billion hole in revenues per year for these companies. And so they have to generate it there in Ukraine. And now with that sort of phasing out, they want to send $14 billion to Israel. There's probably some physical equation you could write, continuity of the military industrial complex. Like all of the foreign wars we're funding sums up to about $50 billion every year, regardless of where we are.
Yeah, man. So tell me, Last Rites, the Death of American Liberty, what's it about?
Well, I was just, I had the impression there are some people out there who still try to use positive thinking about politicians. and I was just trying to cure that habit because, positive thinking about your own life, about your own capacity, about your friends, you can do that. You start thinking positive about government, pretty soon you're going to be wearing, fetters and chains and 98% tax rate and some rascal coming by and seizing your bank account. And it just it's much wiser to be cynical about people with power over you than to be blindly trusting them.
You got that right. And man, this thing is such a red pill. All your books are, you know, feeling your pain. You know it's going to be brutal. It's got evil Bill Clinton on the front. And, you know, all of them are like that. You read the thing and you're just like, oh, man. I've always sung the highest praise. My very favorite, up until now, has been Attention Deficit Democracy. You really make sure that when you write these things that they're masterpieces.
In the FBI chapter in the book that talks about the Bundy Ranch case and how the Justice Department and FBI lied for 3 years to keep one or two of the Bundys in jail, claiming that the FBI had not surrounded their house with snipers. And then it turned out that that they finally admitted it in the discovery process for the criminal trial. And the federal judge put her boot way up their backside and threw the case out of court.
Yep. And but on the last day there, I mean, there was almost a shootout. There's a heavily armed federal SWAT team there of, I'm not sure, made up of which all joint task force types. And the way I remember it, with MP5s and AR-15s, and then the militia guys were standing there in one big huddle, and they had a sniper up on the bridge on the overpass as well. And the cops literally, just like Homer Simpson in The Hedge, just start walking backwards. Actually, we're gonna not do this today. And that was how that ended. Was they backed down to armed civilians, just exactly how it's supposed to work. Because as you say, as the judge later admitted when she angrily threw out the whole damn case, the cops were absolutely the aggressors there in every way. And what they were doing to this guy and his family was illegal.
And folks forget that one of the big fears the FBI had at Ruby Ridge was, as the siege dragged out there, and that's after the feds had killed Vicki Weaver and after the marshals had shot Sandy Weaver in the back, that the feds were paranoid because there were more and more gun owners coming to that area, and the feds were worried about being surrounded. And Janet Reno, ex post facto, changed her justification for the final assault at Waco 2 years afterwards. She said that the biggest concern was that people would be coming to surround gun activists and supporters of the Branch Davidians would be coming to Waco and putting the feds in danger. So that's why she had to send in the tanks and gas the children.
Right. And which, of course, was a lie that somehow the Texas Rangers or the local McClellan County Sheriff's Department couldn't handle that themselves.
Absolutely. It was a scam from the get-go, and it's a very chilling sight to go there and see that simple little sign, this is a vault where the women and children were gassed.
Yeah. I know you just went there recently and wrote a piece for us at the Institute about that.
I was shocked. I was shocked and sad.
It is
Thank
something.
God for ways. I never would have found it.
Yeah, you know, the contrast between like, here I am on a nice day out on the prairie, and geez, this is where you guys did all of that, huh? You know, it's kind of incongruent.
There was a vibe. I was with a friend, and she said that she sensed that there were ghosts there, but she's Celtic, so she's always seeing ghosts.
Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah, Waco. Look, isn't that the thing, Jim? Is that this is the government that'll do Waco to you? I mean, that's what Bill Hicks said in his bit. You know, he goes on about the IRS and he goes on about Waco and a few other things in Rant and E Minor. And he goes, look, the lesson is the state always wins, and they'll bust your house down. They'll kill you. They'll burn you. And they will always win. You lose. You're not free. And that's basically the deal.
Well, at one level, yes. On the other level, if the feds play their cards too hard, then there's going to be a backlash. I think of Congressman Jack Brooks. He was chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. In 1994, he was quoted as saying that the burning to death was too good for the Branch Davidians. And he ended up being defeated when he ran for re-election to Congress that fall. So,
well, that was good. I didn't know that part of it, that was what led to his defeat, you think?
I think it was part of it. I mean, there was just such arrogance. And there were a lot of gun rights groups and Republicans who were able to convince Americans that they would be put a leash on the federal government.
Yeah, well, we see how that worked out. It's a hell of an empire to try to wrestle with, even for the committed.
Well, that's true, but it's always fun to make jokes about it.
Well, you got that right, and this book is full of them. And you know, that's a great selling point, I think, always has been of your writing, is it's pummeling of facts and information, and read it and weep, true history of our time. And yet at the same time, you let us off the hook with a good laugh every few pages too. And you do, you succeed. It's always great. And I can't tell you, Jim, how proud I am that the Institute got to publish this book, that you let us do it, that you gave us a privilege, the opportunity to put this book out.
But here's James Wilson in his State House Yard speech, October 6, 1787, probably, very possibly, the most influential Federalist arguments throughout the ratification debates. It seems like a lot of it kind of flowed from Wilson. We talk about the Federalists so much these days. I know Brian McClanahan, just like I do, talks about how the Federalist is way overblown for its influence during the ratification debates. It did not do much outside the state of New York. Even if you can say that Madison and Jefferson, for example, thought it was very important to include for students at the University of Virginia in 1825, if that doesn't mean it influenced ratification, because it really didn't. But a lot of the arguments were similar prior to when those were published. James Wilson's his speech in October of 1787 is a biggie. And here's one point that he makes, talking about the different structures between the state constitutions and the federal constitution. And this is, or the Constitution for the United States. And this is where Patrick Henry was arguing against it. Like, look, they're totally different. If we're used to constitutions being structured this way, and then now we have it the other way, how are we guaranteed that they're going to be read the same way? Maybe it'll make sense here in a moment. The leading discrimination between the state constitutions and the Constitution of the United States. When the people established the powers of legislation under their separate governments, they invested their representatives with every right and authority which they did not in explicit terms reserve. And therefore, upon every question respecting the jurisdiction of the House of Assembly, if the frame of government is silent, the jurisdiction is efficient and complete. Okay, blah, blah, blah. A lot of words there. But in delegating federal powers, another criterion was necessarily introduced, and the congressional authority is to be collected not from tacit implication, but from the positive grant expressed in the instrument of the Union. Implied powers have always been a lie, and whether you think the Federalists were being scammers or they made a mistake and not just including text like Hancock recommended, either way, the people ratified under the notion, they were sold on the idea that power was expressly delegated, positive grant expressed in the instrument of the Union, and there weren't implied powers on top of it. And here's how he put it again. Hence, it is evident that in the former case, the states, everything which is not reserved is given. But in the latter, that's the federal constitution, the reverse of the proposition prevails, and everything which is not given is reserved. And I think that almost makes Patrick Henry's argument there, because he's like, if all the other constitutions are everything which is not expressly reserved, they automatically have unlimited power other than what has been carved out. And this is a new kind of a novel system. This is a novel system that everything which is not delegated is reserved. He said the distinction being recognized, this is Wilson again, will furnish an answer to those who think the omission of a Bill of Rights a defect in the proposed Constitution. For it would have been superfluous and absurd to have stipulated with a federal body of our own creation that we should enjoy those privileges of which we are not divested either by the intention or the act that has brought that body into existence. TLDR, why list stuff that they can't do, that they already can't do because it's not been delegated to them? And the whole thing would have been cleared up with a statement of delegated and reserved powers. Anyways, Noah Webster, this whole message was repeated over and over and over. I've got just a couple of brief examples so we can power through this. Noah Webster put it this way, just not even 2 full weeks after James Wilson. He said, the Constitution defines the powers of Congress, and every power not expressly delegated to that body remains in the several state legislatures. Charles Pinckney, in a speech in South Carolina, the House of Representatives, in January of 1788, said almost the same thing. The general government has no powers but what are expressly granted to it. It therefore has no power to take away the liberty of the press. People were concerned, like, well, what about the liberty of the press, trial by jury, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, that invaluable blessing, which deserves all the oh man, sometimes I can't read. I can read it in my head. But people who can't pronounce things, that means they learn things from reading, I guess. The gentleman has justly bestowed upon it, I'm sorry about that, is secured by all our state constitutions. And to have mentioned it in our general constitution would perhaps furnish an argument hereafter that the general government had a right to exercise powers not expressly delegated to it. So if you start listing other stuff that they can't do, then people get confused and think, well, it's like all the other constitutions that we've had, and, well, then they can also have all kinds of other powers, tacit implication, as James Wilson put it. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that as well as I should, but doing my best here. Here's Edmund Randolph in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, June of 1788. He said, a Bill of Rights, therefore, accurately speaking, is quite useless, if not dangerous, to a republic. And that's kind of the argument that we're getting. Like, it's going to be confusing if they're not supposed to do stuff, and then we're hammering home that, no, you're really, really not supposed to do stuff. Well, why are you listing it in the first place? And I think, again, that argument has legs as long as it's clearly in the text of the Constitution that they're only authorized to do the stuff that's been delegated to them. And here's James Wilson again. This is in the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, November of 1787. He said, a Bill of Rights is by no means a necessary measure. In a government possessed of enumerated powers, such a measure would not only be unnecessary, but preposterous and dangerous. And he explains a little bit why, and here's a brief take. If we attempt an enumeration, everything that is not enumerated is presumed to be given. And that's where we get to, that's how Madison was kind of creative in this. and putting together the 9th and the 10th Amendment, what became the 9th and the 10th Amendments. We know that he wanted the 10th Amendment to be part of a new Article 7 along with separation of powers, but the final version ended up being different. Anyways, the consequence is that an imperfect enumeration would throw all implied power into the scale of the government, and the rights of the people would be rendered incomplete. So they were concerned. Their warning was, and some of them were probably genuine, some of them maybe Hamilton was a little scammy about it, but it is an interesting argument to me. They're basically saying, like, if as soon as you start listing stuff, then people are going to start reading the document upside down. Instead of being a system of delegating reserve powers, it's going to be they do everything other than what's carved out. And I think that's how a lot of people treat it today. So maybe there's something to that.
The first thing I want to say is, A, we are already in the emergency because the Fed exists. The Fed is the emergency. You know, this type of emergency that they're talking about is how the Fed would save themselves. They're not looking to save us. They're looking to save themselves in a financial panic. And apparently they have all the legalese ready to justify anything they want to do. That further shows us how messed up laws are. You know, it shows that law has lost virtually its meaning. And that's typical of authoritarians. They will manipulate laws and language, especially. I mean, we saw with COVID how language with vaccine, you just change what the word vaccine means. That's all done. And, you know, I like to use, there's a lot of people that don't understand that liberal, if you think of liberals today, the word liberal used to be libertarians, the exact opposite. But it was hijacked. You know, this is typical. You change the meaning of words to make it mean what you want to mean. So that's why people will say classical liberal. That means the classical liberals are the libertarians. So language is used, you know, manipulated, and laws are also used as weapons. One example that came to my mind is a company, if they charge a too high price, according to bureaucrats, they're gouging. If it's too low, it's dumping, according to bureaucrats. And if it's the same as their competitors, it's collusion. So no matter what price you have, if they want to come after you for something, they have the laws all set. And this is not what law is supposed to be about. It's totally, and that's why if the Fed has a doomsday book, they have their legal ways of doing whatever they want. And that's not what law is about. I want to close this segment by saying I found a quote, and most of us have heard it from Tacitus, and I think he was right. He said, the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. And boy, is that right on.
I can't keep up how many thousands and thousands of pages. If we get new people in, we're going to shrink it, you know, but it keeps expanding and expanding. Even when the people are trying to do it, some of them are very sincere, but the situation, the whole organization of government is so powerful and there's so much money behind it, it's not going to be very easy until the market demands that it collapse, and that will be a big problem. But, you know, over the years, most people associate me with an effort to audit the Fed because I want to know what's going on. And here they are, they're telling us the Doomsday Book, but it's been secret all this time, and they had to work hard to get it out. So the information leaks out. I think everybody knows that the Federal Reserve works in top secrecy. I think the Federal Reserve Board chairman and the boards are usually just front people for the people who really have the control. And those are the oligarchs we have, the people who run the military-industrial complex and the welfare state, because they have to have the money. Now, when this subject came up in the committees when I was in Congress, it was always, I would point out a few of these things, and they said, well, yes, that's true, but the problem isn't the Fed, the problem is the Congress, which they have a half a truth there. It is the problem of the Congress. It's the problem of the people. People want to spend too much, so they blame the people. But then they say it's always the Congress if they wouldn't spend so much money. But of course, if we didn't have the Fed, that's readily available for financing anything and everything that the bureaucrats, you know, put in place as a favor to the people who are really running the show. And that's what's happening. They do have control, and there are some people. And if you say it's a conspiracy, people frown on that. But you know, there are two types of conspiracies. One that's just made up out of thin air, and it's just an assumption. And the other one is a true conspiracy, and where people got together and planned it. And there's a lot of good people conspiring together to bring about liberty. There are other people get together and conspiring. How are we going to spread our effort of cultural Marxism? So they're doing that all the time. But when I would bring the subject up to a Federal Reserve Board chairman and say that what's the matter with about the audit? We need to know about this, and they would hem and haw and say a few decent things, pretending they were all for it. But then they would always go back to one word, no matter which chairman it was. They always say, we have to be careful, though. because we have to have independence of the Federal Reserve. We don't need a lot of people, lobbyists and congressmen and other people knowing what's going on. So they want independence away from this sinister influence. But my argument always with that, and I warn people, I say, anytime the Fed say they want independence, substitute the word secrecy, because that's what their goal is, but they'll never be able to keep it secret. As time goes on, it'll become more apparent, and the markets help tell us that, and they'll let us know as much as anything, even though the people who want to maintain the system, unfortunately, right now they're in control of the justice system and the police department, the people that want to come in and use the guns to enforce the system that we have. But conditions are getting rockier, and it'll be more necessary than ever that we know what the Fed has in store for us under what's generally outlined in the Doomsday Book. But it shouldn't be that complicated. It should be that we follow the Constitution, have honest money, and have decent people there, and a monetary system that does not allow counterfeiting.
Liberty is available. The people just need to want it, and they have to see the benefits of it, and hopefully we help provide those benefits.
I don't have the optimism of saying, one more election or two, and we're going to have control of the Congress, and we're going to reverse all this. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what will happen is people will realize the difference, and we will see a day when we will have our way and we'll be able to express ourselves for the cause of liberty. Please come back to the Liberty Report soon.
Now, given this preliminary metaphysical sketch, and before we proceed to look at Aristotle's epistemology, let's identify one cardinal metaphysical principle implicit in what I've said so far, although not explicitly identified by Aristotle himself. Aristotle is the true author of the principle of the primacy of existence, as against the principle of the primacy of consciousness. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with this distinction, I will have to interrupt to explain briefly here, because otherwise you cannot appreciate the significance of Aristotle's philosophy. The primacy of existence is the view that reality, to put it colloquially, comes first. It is the metaphysical primary. Reality is what it is, independent of the content or actions of any consciousness. It is the irreducible primary which sets the terms for consciousness. And consciousness is simply a man's or an animal's faculty for perceiving, grasping, identifying, coming to know the facts of reality. On the primacy of existence view, consciousness has no power to alter the facts of reality. And no matter how much it wishes, hopes, fears, believes, opines, etc., it cannot magically change reality. Facts are what they are, independent of consciousness. Now, the opposite view is called the primacy of consciousness. And this is the view that consciousness in some form comes first. It is the metaphysical primary, the irreducible entity which sets the terms for reality. And reality is somehow an offshoot or derivative or byproduct of the activities or content of consciousness. On this view, consciousness in effect has magical powers. It has the power to produce or shape reality. Facts are not what they are, but rather they are whatever the ruling consciousness chooses them to be. Now, if you want a simple daily example of the primacy of consciousness, any act of evasion implies it. You come into your bedroom after a day at work and you find your wife in another man's arms. And you find this a shattering experience, for reasons I needn't elaborate. You don't want it to be true, so let us say you evade. You blank it out, you simply push it out of your mind. What is your premise? This is too horrible to be real. If I don't see it, it won't exist. What is the implication? My consciousness controls reality. Facts are whatever I want them to be. That is the primacy of consciousness in homey daily action. Now, the point here is that in terms of philosophic approach, every fundamental approach opposed to Aristotle's represents the primacy of consciousness, either explicitly and nakedly, as was primarily the case in the modern post-Kantian world, or else implicitly and indirectly, as was true largely in the ancient world. But if you want an explicit example of primacy of consciousness in the ancient world, the sophists would be an example of it. Man's arbitrary feelings and opinions are the measure of all things, according to them. Well, what does that mean? It means that truth or facts are whatever any individual arbitrarily chooses them to be. His feelings and opinions, the content of his consciousness is omnipotent, for him, of course. It shapes reality, which somehow snaps into line and becomes for him whatever his consciousness dictates. Now, that is the primacy of consciousness on an individual level. Each individual consciousness has primacy over existence. And in this respect, all subjectivism, all skepticism represents the primacy of consciousness. Or consider Platonism. Now, here the primacy of consciousness is indirect, but nevertheless real. If the father of the primacy of existence is Aristotle, then the most influential father of the primacy of consciousness is Plato. What is his world of forms, to take just one point? What are they? Well, as Aristotle was the first to observe, the forms are actually abstractions. They are phenomena pertaining to man's method of organizing and grasping the facts given to him by his senses. But Plato erects them into separate entities which shape and control this world, which means he makes this world a reflection of phenomena of consciousness. Now, this is the primacy of consciousness. By implication. I say by implication because Plato himself did not regard the forms, as you know, as having any connection essentially to consciousness. He thought of them as special non-conscious entities. But in actual fact, abstractions is all that they are. And in this way, his philosophy reduces by implication to the primacy of consciousness. Or take Plato's myth of the demiurge. How do we account for order in this world, says Plato? Why does the world have the law and order it does? The physical world. And his answer is, well, a soul, a consciousness, wandered by and desired order and perfection, and thereby shaped reality, shaped the physical world in accordance with its wishes. That's the primacy of consciousness. Law and order in the physical world are not irreducible natural facts, but the resultant of the operations of a supernatural consciousness. Or consider Plato's very approach to philosophy at the deepest level and at the outset. What is his starting point? Well, his starting point is the demands of man's method of acquiring knowledge. Plato's starting point, if you remember my lecture a few weeks ago, is the axiom in effect is man must know. Knowledge must be real. Conceptual knowledge must be real. Now he goes on, what must reality be if it is to satisfy, fulfill, live up to man's need of a certain kind of knowledge? Well, that is, as an approach, the primacy of consciousness, again by implication. Because the starting point is consciousness needs something. It wants something. It has to have something, a certain kind of knowledge in this case. Therefore, reality must have such and such a nature. That implies that reality is determined by man's method of knowing it. That is the primacy of consciousness. Now, Aristotle is the exact opposite of Plato on all these points. Not only does he dispose of Plato's forms and demiurges and supernatural consciousnesses of all sorts, he refuses to endorse Plato's approach to the whole subject of philosophy. According to Aristotle, the question you start with is not, what must reality be in order to make it possible for us to acquire knowledge of it? But simply, what, as a matter of fact, is reality? And then, given that it is that way, by what processes are we able to acquire knowledge of it? First comes reality, and then, and on the basis of its nature, we turn to the question, what processes of knowledge are suitable for acquiring knowledge of such a reality? Now, my lecture title on the brochure for this lecture is A Revolution, the Birth of Reason. But the metaphysical meaning of this is actually the birth of reality. And I mean here, of course, of the discovery of reality. Because in this profound sense, it was Aristotle who first discovered the existence, the primacy of reality. All the others, in their various ways, engage in disconnected, free-floating theorizing. They come at some point to a contradiction, to some conclusion, in conflict with the facts of reality as reported by our senses, and they proceed to say, down with reality. Or rather, they don't put it that way. They say, this isn't reality. This is simply appearances. True reality is the world that lives up to our theories. Now, Aristotle refuses to endorse any dichotomy between reality and appearance. Reality is what we observe, and any theories which go counter to it are simply wrong. Aristotle's most characteristic attitude comes across when he deals, for instance, with the theories of various pre-Socratics, you know, the kind that says there is no permanence, or there is no change, or whatever it happens to be. They take some equally obvious fact and simply say it can't be. You can't walk across a room. Zeno gives whole pages of arguments as to why you can't do it. And Aristotle's typical procedure is he conscientiously presents their arguments, and then he says matter-of-factly, but we see these things. They are obvious. They are facts. And facts are facts. And then, of course, since he's a great philosopher, he proceeds to make mincemeat of the arguments that led to the denial of those facts. In this sense, he is preeminently the realist in philosophy. That's why I had to start with the rudiments of his metaphysics, of his own view of reality, and only now can proceed to his epistemology. Now, I should mention that Aristotle is not a fully consistent representative of the primacy of existence. There is always a vestigial, contradictory, Platonic element in him to the very end of his days. But, and this you need to know for historical accuracy, and I'll point out occasional touches in these lectures. But that is unimportant to him qua Aristotelian, which is our primary concern in these lectures.